There's nothing quite like the silence before dawn on a farm that's been in your family for 3 generations. Jerome Hale knew this silence intimately, the way it wrapped around the old farmhouse like a prayer, the way it settled in the soil beneath his boots as he stepped onto the porch each morning before the sun broke the horizon. At 65, his hands were maps of calluses and scars, each ridge and valley telling stories of crops planted, fences mended, and seasons weathered. The morning had begun like any other on the Hale land. A slow, golden sunrise spilled over the flat horizon, warming the tops of the tall corn stalks and glinting off the dewdrops that clung to the fence posts. Jerome had been awake before the first rooster crowed, his boots laced tight, his worn hat pulled low over his brow. The farmhouse was quiet, empty but for the groaning of old boards beneath his feet and the occasional creak of settling timbers. He hadn't bothered turning on the radio yet. Mornings were for listening to the land. He moved through his routine with the calm certainty of a man who had done the same work for decades. Fed the chickens, checked the irrigation system, and walked the perimeter of the southern field, pausing every so often to feel the soil between his fingers. But there were signs, subtle, quiet, unsettling. The hens hadn't laid properly in days. The cattle had grown restless, milling near the northern fence line in the dead of night, snorting like something was stirring under their hooves. And then came the earthquake that split open the earth itself, revealing a tunnel that would change everything Jerome thought he knew about the land beneath his feet. What Jerome Hale discovered in that tunnel didn't just change his life. It shocked an entire nation and exposed a secret that powerful men had fought to keep buried for decades. A secret that had been festering beneath the fertile soil of American heartland farms, while generations of families worked above, unaware of the theft occurring directly under their feet. A secret that would ignite a firestorm of corporate panic, government investigations, and long overdue justice. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary story, tell us in the comments where you were watching from. And if you want to know what happens when an ordinary farmer takes on forces that have operated in the shadows for generations, make sure you are subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something truly special for you. The full account of how one man's discovery led to the exposure of one of the most elaborate corporate conspiracies in American history. Jerome Hale had always believed a man's relationship with his land wasn't something to be managed. It was something to be honored. This farm had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, and now it was his. 40 years he'd worked this soil, and not a day had gone by that he didn't give thanks for it. The 150 acres that comprised the Hale farm rolled gently from east to west, primarily dedicated to corn and soybeans, with a modest herd of 32 cattle grazing the northern pastures. The red barn, built by his grandfather in 1937, stood proudly against the backdrop of distant hills, its paint faded but still defiant against the elements. The two-story farmhouse, white clapboard with blue shutters, had witnessed the birth and death of 2 generations of Hales, its walls absorbing their joys and sorrows like the fields absorbed the rain. Jerome could still see his father, Thomas Hale, walking these same fields, pausing to pull a weed or examine a cornstalk with the reverence of a man examining scripture. "The land speaks, son," he would say, kneeling to scoop a handful of soil. "Our job is to listen." Those words had become something of a mantra for Jerome, a truth passed down alongside the deed to the farm. "Dad, what exactly are we listening for?" a young Jerome had asked, kneeling beside his father in the south field, the sun warm on his back, the smell of earth rich in his nostrils. Thomas had smiled, his leathery face creasing like the pages of a well-read book. "Life, son, the soil breathes, the roots whisper, the insects sing. When everything's in harmony, you can feel it in your bones." That harmony had guided Jerome through droughts and floods, through market crashes and recovery, through the loss of his wife, Margaret, to cancer 7 years ago. The rhythm of the farm had been his constant, his anchor in a world that changed too fast and too carelessly. After high school, unlike many of his peers who fled to cities and suburbs, Jerome had enlisted in the Army. He served 4 years, including one tour in Vietnam, where he'd met Henry Morris, a fellow farm boy from one county over. They'd bonded over shared homesickness for the smell of freshly turned soil and the sound of wind through corn stalks. In the mud and chaos of war, they'd saved each other's lives more than once. Henry pulling Jerome from the wreckage of a transport hit by a mine. Jerome carrying Henry through a kilometer of jungle when malaria had left him delirious and burning with fever. "You die, I die," Henry had said to him one night as they huddled in a foxhole, the distant thump of artillery punctuating the darkness. "We're going home, both of us, back to the dirt that makes sense." And they had. Jerome came home to take over the family farm when his father's knees could no longer bear the daily work. Henry settled 10 miles west, rehabilitating his uncle's struggling cattle operation. For 40 years, they'd weathered the changing agricultural landscape together. The corporate buyouts, the genetically modified seeds, the increasingly erratic weather patterns that old-timers attributed to God's moods and younger farmers called climate change. Every Sunday after church, they still met for coffee at Dory's Diner in town, comparing notes on rainfall and crop yields, sharing tools and labor when needed. Jerome's lone tractor, a 1982 John Deere that he maintained with almost religious devotion, had been started by Henry's jumper cables more times than either man cared to admit. Jerome was what locals called salt of the earth, straightforward, hardworking, and fiercely independent. He could predict rain 3 days out by the way his left knee ached. He knew every inch of his property by heart, could walk it blindfolded and still tell you whether he was standing in the north field or the south by the feel of the soil beneath his boots. Which is why the subtle changes had troubled him so deeply. "Something ain't right," he told Henry over coffee 3 weeks before the earthquake. "Land feels different somehow, like it's holding its breath." Henry had nodded thoughtfully, stirring a third packet of sugar into his coffee. At 67, his once black hair had gone completely white, but his eyes were still sharp as winter frost. "My cattle been acting strange too, more skittish than usual. You check your soil? Might be that new fertilizer they've been pushing." But Jerome had checked. pH levels normal, nitrogen content stable. On paper, everything looked fine. Yet something in his bones, the same bones that could sense coming rain and frost, told him the land was trying to warn him. He just couldn't understand what it was saying. Not yet. The farm had become Jerome's whole world after Margaret passed. Their son David had moved to Chicago 15 years earlier, establishing himself as an accountant with a big firm downtown. He called dutifully every Sunday evening, but the conversations were increasingly stilted, bridging a gap that widened with each passing year. David had 2 children, a boy and a girl, both teenagers now, who had visited the farm exactly twice in their lives, each time regarding the place with the polite disinterest of tourists at a museum exhibit. "It's not that they don't care, Dad," David had explained during his last visit, watching his children scroll through their phones on the porch swing where Jerome had once taught David to whittle. "It's just different for them. They're digital natives." Jerome hadn't argued. He understood that the world changed, that each generation found its own path. But he couldn't help wondering what would happen to the farm after he was gone. If all this land, all this history, all this life would be reduced to a listing on a real estate website, sold to the highest bidder without regard for its story. Those thoughts occupied him more frequently now, as he noticed the increasing number of neighboring farms being sold to corporate agricultural conglomerates. The Willard place 3 miles east, 400 acres, that had been in the same family since before the Civil War, had been purchased by Mid-American Agri-Global just last spring. The Wilsons 2 miles north had sold to a real estate developer who was already drawing up plans for a subdivision of identical houses with meaningless names like Meadowview and Sunset Ridge. Sometimes Jerome felt like a holdout from another era, a relic stubbornly clinging to ways of life that the modern world had deemed inefficient and obsolete. But the land still spoke to him, still needed him, still provided for him. And that was enough, or it had been, until the earth itself began to change beneath his feet. The signs had started small, almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't know the land as intimately as Jerome. First, it was the chickens, 12 Rhode Island Reds that normally produced eggs with reliable consistency, suddenly laying less, their yolks paler, the shells sometimes too fragile to handle. "Might be their feed," suggested Marlene at the general store when Jerome mentioned it while picking up supplies. "That new brand they got in last month has different additives. Some folks been complaining." But Jerome hadn't changed their feed. His chickens ate the same mix of commercial feed and kitchen scraps they always had, supplemented by whatever insects they scratched up from the yard. He'd even taken one of the hens to Dr. Linden, the veterinarian in town, who'd found nothing physically wrong with the bird. Sometimes these things just happen, Dr. Linden had said with a shrug. Chickens are sensitive to changes in their environment. Could be a fox prowling around at night, stressing them out. Jerome had nodded, but he didn't believe it. The chicken coop was secure, and his old retriever, Buck, would have raised hell if a predator had been sniffing around. Besides, it wasn't just the chickens. The cattle were acting strangely too. Jerome's modest herd had always been even-tempered, predictable in their movements. They grazed the North 40 during the day, returning to the barn area as dusk approached. But now they clustered near the far northern fence line, as far from the southern fields as possible, their usual docility replaced by nervous energy. Several times Jerome had found them pressing against the fence, eyes wide, nostrils flaring, as though trying to escape something only they could sense. Might be coyotes, suggested Dr. Linden, during his routine visit to check on a pregnant heifer. Or maybe there's a change in the water table affecting the taste of the grass in certain areas. Jerome had nodded politely, but he didn't believe that either. Coyotes had always been present. The cattle were used to them, and he'd tested the water himself. Nothing unusual there. Then the well water began to taste different. Not obviously bad or contaminated, but with a subtle metallic aftertaste that hadn't been there before. Jerome had sent a sample to the county extension office for testing. The results came back normal, within acceptable parameters for all standard contaminants. Could be minerals leaching in from a new source, the technician had suggested over the phone. Sometimes groundwater channels shift, especially after heavy rain. But they hadn't had heavy rain. In fact, they were in the third year of a moderate drought, with precipitation levels consistently below average. Jerome had checked his rain gauge religiously, 4 inches year to date, compared to the historical average of 18.7 for this point in the season. He began to keep a journal of the anomalies, a habit he'd picked up from his father, who had documented everything from crop yields to wildlife sightings throughout his tenure on the farm. The entries grew more frequent as spring turned to summer. May 15th, chickens laid only 4 eggs today, found 3 cows on the wrong side of the north fence. May 22nd, Buck refuses to enter the south field, stands at the edge and growls. May 30, strange smell near the old saw like metal and something burning. June 5, found dead birds, 3 sparrows, 1 cardinal, near the south fence. No visible injuries. June 12, well, water tastes worse. Using bottled water for drinking now. By early evening on June 15th, the wind shifted. It blew heavy and warm from the east, carrying with it a strange tang in the air, part mineral, part chemical, and entirely unfamiliar. Jerome stood on the porch as the sun dipped behind the low hills and watched the tall grass sway in strange, uneven patterns. He could feel something pressing just beneath the calm, as though the earth was holding its breath. Pressure systems, muttered Frank Willard, the retired geology teacher who sometimes stopped by with fresh honey from his bees. The limestone beds under this county run deep. Sometimes they shift, release gases. Nothing to worry about. But Jerome had lived through droughts and floods, through tornadoes that stripped bark from trees and lightning strikes that split ancient oaks down the middle. This felt different. This felt deliberate. That night, long after he'd gone to bed, the stillness shattered. At first it was subtle, a low vibration, like a distant freight train passing through far-off hills. Jerome stirred in bed, half awake, unsure if the sound was real or something from a dream. But then the bed frame jolted violently, and the glass on his nightstand tipped and shattered on the hardwood floor. The walls groaned, the old nails squealing as the wood swayed under unseen pressure. Jerome shot upright, heart pounding in his chest. He had grown up under tornado warnings, seen trees twisted into ropes by wind. But this was something else. The house itself seemed to shift, shuddering like a living thing under duress. Books toppled from the shelves, picture frames fell, and from the kitchen came the unmistakable crash of dishes breaking. He threw on a shirt, grabbed his flashlight, and rushed out the front door, nearly losing his balance as the ground rolled beneath his feet. Outside, the night was electric with tension. The stars above flickered, as if the sky itself was uneasy. Jerome stumbled into the yard, catching himself on a fence post. Behind him, the house creaked ominously, the porch listing to one side. Then, just as quickly as it began, the shaking stopped. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the ragged breaths escaping his lungs. He turned slowly, shining his light across the fields. Cracks had split the yard, jagged and deep. His barn listed awkwardly, and the windmill beside it no longer turned. He stood in the silence for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything, to make sense, but it didn't. The cattle were panicking, their frightened lowing carrying across the dark fields. Buck was barking frantically, running in circles near the house. And from somewhere to the south came a new sound, a low, sustained hiss, like air escaping from a pressurized container. Jerome made his way toward the sound, flashlight beam bouncing ahead of him as he navigated the suddenly treacherous landscape of his own yard. The ground felt different beneath his boots, softer, less stable, as though the very foundation of the earth had been compromised. He reached the edge of the south field and stopped cold. There, in the beam of his flashlight, was a sight his mind initially refused to process. A section of his cornfield had simply collapsed. A circular area about 30 feet in diameter had dropped several feet, the corn stalks leaning inward toward the center like worshippers bowing to an altar. And from the middle of this depression rose tendrils of vapor, visible in the flashlight beam, carrying that same metallic smell he'd noticed earlier, but stronger now, more insistent. Jerome took a step back, instinctively recoiling from the unnatural sight. This wasn't a typical sinkhole or erosion pattern. This was something else entirely, something that sent a primal warning signal racing up his spine. He retreated to the house where he spent the remainder of the night sitting at the kitchen table, a shotgun across his lap, watching the windows for signs of further disturbance. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the settling house, every gust of wind against the shutters, sent his heart racing anew. As the first gray light of dawn seeped through the windows, Jerome made a pot of coffee and tried to make sense of what had happened. Earthquakes weren't common in this part of the country, but they weren't unheard of either. The New Madrid fault line lay several hundred miles to the south and had produced catastrophic quakes in the early 1800s that had reportedly rung church bells in Boston. But this felt targeted somehow, localized, as though the tremor had been directed specifically at his land, which was, of course, ridiculous. Earthquakes didn't target individual farms. They didn't create perfect circular depressions. And they certainly didn't produce chemical smells and strange vapors. Dawn revealed the full extent of the earthquake's impact. The house had survived with minor damage, a testament to his grandfather's craftsmanship, but the barn would need significant repairs. The windmill had lost 2 blades, and several fence sections lay flat, allowing 3 of his cattle to wander onto the road before he managed to corral them back to the pasture. But it was the southern field that bore the most dramatic evidence of the night's violence. In the daylight, the collapsed section was even more unsettling. The corn plants were crushed and flattened, and at the center of the depression was what appeared to be a hole, a perfect circular opening descending into darkness. "Never seen anything like it," said Sheriff Danvers, who'd come out to assess damage reports across the county. Earthquake measuring 5.4 on the Richter scale, according to the USGS. Epicenter about 3 miles southeast of here. Strange for this region. "Was strange isn't the word I'd use," Jerome replied, watching as the sheriff's boots left deep prints in the suddenly loose soil near the crack. "Unnatural is more like it." "Earthquakes are natural events, Mr. Hale," the sheriff said, making notes on his clipboard. "Just not common around here." "And that?" Jerome asked, pointing to the perfectly circular hole at the center of the depression. "That natural too?" Sheriff Danvers frowned, adjusting his hat as he peered into the darkness. "Could be a sinkhole. Limestone underneath can dissolve, create caverns. Earthquake might have collapsed a ceiling we didn't know was there." "I've lived on this land my entire life," Jerome said quietly. "My father before me, his father before him. If there was a cavern under this field, we'd have known about it." The sheriff shrugged, clearly eager to move on to the next property on his list. "Nature's full of surprises, Mr. Hale. I'd rope this off if I were you. Keep your livestock away from it until someone from the county can come take a look." As the sheriff's cruiser disappeared down the driveway, Jerome stood at the edge of the depression, staring at the perfect circle of darkness at its center. The smell was stronger now in the morning heat, that same metallic chemical odor that had been haunting his land for weeks. The land was trying to tell him something. And finally, Jerome was beginning to understand what it was saying. Morning arrived, gray and overcast, casting long, thin shadows across the torn-up earth. Jerome made his way slowly across the southern field, stepping carefully over loose soil and a broken fence post. The land had ruptured in the night. He could see it from 100 yards away. A massive gash had opened near the old well, a deep, jagged wound in the earth that stretched down into complete darkness. It wasn't just a crack, it was a chasm. As he approached, the smell hit him. Wet clay and something else, sharp and acrid. It reminded him of the time lightning had struck an old propane tank 2 farms over. A chemical burn, low and metallic in the nose. He crouched near the edge and shined his flashlight downward. At first, it looked like rock and root, but then the beam caught something. Metallic glints, a smooth curve in the soil, as though something artificial had been unearthed. He leaned closer, heart racing, and realized that what he was looking at wasn't a natural formation at all. It was a tunnel, wide, smooth, curved unnaturally, leading into blackness. He took a step back, breath caught in his throat. The tremor, the animals, the smell, it all fit now in a way he couldn't accept. Something was buried under his land, something man-made, and it hadn't been there before, or at least he hadn't known it was there. Jerome returned to the farmhouse and retrieved his father's old geological survey maps from the bottom drawer of the desk. Thomas Hale had been meticulous about documenting the land, soil composition, natural springs, drainage patterns. The yellowed pages crinkled beneath Jerome's weathered fingers as he spread them across the kitchen table. The maps showed nothing unusual about the southern field. According to his father's careful notations, it was primarily clay-based soil transitioning to limestone bedrock approximately 20 feet down. No caves, no underground water sources, nothing that would explain what Jerome had just seen. He pulled out another book, his grandfather's journal from when he'd first purchased the land in 1931. The handwriting was faded but still legible, detailing crop rotations, building projects, and interactions with neighboring farmers. No mention of tunnels or underground structures. "I know every inch of this land," Jerome muttered to himself, running his finger along a contour line on one of the maps. "Every rock, every spring, every dip and rise. There shouldn't be anything down there that I don't know about." But there was. A tunnel, man-made, under his corn. He reached for his father's journal next, a leather-bound volume that chronicled the farm's operations from 1953 to 1978. Thomas Hale had been even more meticulous than his father, noting everything from rainfall amounts to crop yields to maintenance performed on equipment. If anyone would have documented unusual activity on the farm, it would have been him. Jerome flipped through the pages, scanning entries from the 1960s, when his father was in his prime and Jerome himself was just a teenager, learning the rhythms of farm life. There was nothing about construction, excavation, or any kind of underground work. Just the steady cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, and preparing for the next season. One entry from July 1964 caught his eye. Strange men in suits visited today, asking about mineral rights. Said they were from the State Geological Survey. Showed credentials but seemed off somehow. Asked too many questions about the South Field specifically. Told them mineral rights stay with the land, always have. They left business cards but no company name, just phone numbers. Tore them up after they left. Don't trust men who won't say who they work for. Jerome sat back, his father's words resonating across the decades. Men asking about the South Field, the exact area where the tunnel now gaped open. Men who had made his father suspicious enough to tear up their contact information. The violation of it struck him like a physical blow. Someone had been planning this, whatever this was, as far back as 1964. While his father was working the land above, someone had been eyeing what lay beneath. He reached for the phone and dialed the number he knew by heart. Henry answered on the second ring, his voice already gruff with caffeine and wariness. "Henry," Jerome said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I need you to come out here. There's something under my land." There was a pause on the line. the weight of 40 years of friendship filling the silence. "What kind of something?" Henry finally asked. "The kind that shouldn't be there, the kind that someone put there without asking." Jerome's voice tightened. "And I think they've been there since we were in high school." Another pause, shorter this time. "I'll be there in 20. Jerome hung up and returned to the window, staring out at the southern field. The land had been speaking to him all along. The nervous cattle, the unproductive chickens, the strange smells carried on the wind. It had been warning him, and he hadn't understood until the earth itself had split open to reveal its secret. He thought about his father, who had worked this land with such care and attention, who had taught Jerome to listen to what the soil was telling him. Had Thomas Hale known or suspected what was happening beneath his feet? Had he felt the same unease that Jerome had been experiencing these past weeks? The thought that someone had been violating his family's land for decades, secretly operating beneath the surface while 3 generations of Hales tended the soil above, filled Jerome with a cold, steady anger. This wasn't just trespassing. This was theft of security, of autonomy, of the sacred trust between a farmer and his land. Henry arrived 17 minutes later, his old Dodge pickup kicking up dust as it rolled down the gravel driveway. He stepped out dressed in work boots and a battered utility jacket, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. His face, weathered like the land itself, tightened into a frown as soon as he saw Jerome's expression. "That bad?" he asked, not really a question. Jerome nodded and led the way across the field. They moved in silence, both men conserving their breath for the walk and their words for what lay ahead. When they reached the edge of the depression, Henry let out a low whistle. "Hell of a hole," he muttered, kneeling down to examine the edge. "Looks deep." Jerome nodded. "There's more to it. I saw something down there. Metal shapes that didn't make sense." Henry shot him a look. "You think it's a well?" "No, too wide, too smooth. I think someone dug it." Henry stared into the darkness for a long moment. Then he unzipped his bag and pulled out a pair of high-powered flashlights and a coil of climbing rope. "Then I guess we're going to find out." They worked in silence, securing the rope to the axle of Henry's truck and testing its weight. Jerome went first, descending slowly, the flashlight clutched tightly in his free hand. The dirt walls around him were warm to the touch, strangely so, and layered with bands of red and gray that shimmered under the light. The air grew heavier with each foot of descent, thick with a strange mineral scent that stung the back of his throat. By the time his boots touched the floor of the hole, sweat clung to his back and his shirt was damp beneath his coat. He swung the light in a slow arc and froze. The tunnel wasn't just there, it was intentional. A wide hollow passage carved into the earth, extending in both directions. The walls unnaturally smooth and laced with what looked like veins of black rock pulsing faintly in the light. Jerome thought of his father, of his grandfather, of generations of Hales who had worked this land, believing they knew its secrets, believing they were its stewards. None of them had known what lay beneath their feet. The betrayal of it burned in his chest like acid. Henry joined him a minute later, grunting as he landed beside Jerome. "Well," he said, glancing around, "ain't no natural formation, that's for sure." They walked deeper, the tunnel swallowing the sound of their footsteps. The walls began to change, the black veins growing more prominent, intersecting in geometric patterns. Jerome ran his fingers across the lines. They weren't random. They felt etched, cut into the soil with purpose. "Look at these," Henry muttered, shining his light on a section where the patterns formed an almost perfect grid. "These ain't natural. Someone engineered this." Jerome nodded, his throat tight. "What for? And when?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Henry moved his light across the ceiling, where similar patterns were visible. "This took serious equipment, serious time. You don't just dig something like this without leaving traces above ground." But they had. Someone had hollowed out the earth beneath the Hale farm without leaving evidence visible to 3 generations of men who knew every inch of the land. The implications were staggering and unsettling. "These support structures," Henry said, pointing to metal ribs embedded in the walls at regular intervals. "They're old but well-designed. Reminds me of the mining tunnels we saw in those hills outside Da Nang." Jerome nodded, the memory surfacing of a reconnaissance mission where they'd discovered Viet Cong tunnels hidden in the jungle. "But those were rough, hand-dug. This is industrial." Professional. Military grade, Henry agreed, examining one of the metal supports more closely, or close to it. As they moved deeper, the tunnel widened slightly, the ceiling rising to accommodate what appeared to be utility lines running along the upper portion of the walls. Some were clearly electrical, while others looked like pipes or conduits of some kind. Someone's powering something down here, Henry said, pointing to a junction box half hidden behind a metal panel. Recently, too. Look at how clean those connections are. Farther in, debris littered the edges. Tangled roots, broken boards, rusted bolts, and a half-buried length of pipe crusted with dirt and age. Jerome knelt beside a pile of what looked like construction waste, splintered wood, fragments of metal, the torn corner of what might have been a tarp. Army Corps of Engineers used to build tunnels like this, Henry said, his voice tight with recognition. During the Cold War, bunkers, escape routes, storage facilities. But those were documented on government land. This isn't government land, Jerome replied, his voice harsh in the enclosed space. This is my land, has been since 1931. Henry nodded grimly, which means whoever built this didn't have permission, or they got it from someone who had no right to give it. They pressed on, the tunnel widening slightly as they moved deeper. The air quality deteriorated, becoming thick with a sulfuric smell that caught in the back of the throat. Smells like chemicals, Henry said, covering his nose with his sleeve. Industrial stuff. Jerome nodded, his eyes watering slightly. Reminds me of the petroleum tents in Nam. That same chemical burn. The floor beneath their feet changed as well, becoming smoother, with what appeared to be drainage channels running along the edges. Small puddles had formed in these channels, the liquid in them dark and oily, reflecting their flashlight beams and rainbow patterns. Oil, Henry said, crouching to examine one of the puddles more closely. Crude by the smell of it, unrefined. Jerome stared at the dark liquid, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. They're drilling under my farm. They're taking oil from beneath my land. Looks that way, Henry agreed, straightening up. Question is, who's they and how long has this been going on? Then came the sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A mechanical hum, barely audible but rhythmic, pulsing beneath their feet like a heartbeat. They stopped, listening intently, the silence between pulses as telling as the sound itself. That's active, Henry whispered, his eyes meeting Jerome's in the dim light. That's not old equipment left behind. That's something still running. Jerome's mind raced. Not only was there a tunnel beneath his farm, but it was currently in use. Someone was operating machinery under his land right now without his knowledge or consent. The violation was no longer historical. It was immediate and ongoing. As they continued forward, the debris became more organized, less random. They passed what appeared to be a storage area, plastic crates stacked against one wall, their contents hidden, but their purpose clear. This wasn't abandoned infrastructure. This was current operations. Jerome, Henry called softly from a few feet ahead. You need to see this. Jerome moved to his friend's side, following the beam of his flashlight to a piece of blackened wood half buried in the mud. Henry knelt, brushing dirt away until letters emerged, scorched into the grain. MLBCO. The rest had been eaten away by time or fire, but it was enough. MLB, Jerome repeated, the letters burning into his memory. Mean anything to you? Henry shook his head. Not offhand, could be anything. Mining company, oil operation, government code name. Look at this, Henry said, picking up what appeared to be an old pocket watch from beside the charred wood. The face was cracked, the hands frozen at 4:17, but the back was still intact, engraved with a date, June 12, 1964. 1964, Jerome repeated, taking the watch in his hand. My father was working this land in 1964. They were under his feet the whole time. Henry's expression darkened. Whoever they are, they're still here. That machinery we're hearing isn't 60 years old. That's modern equipment. Jerome felt the weight of history and deception pressing down on him, as tangible as the earth above the tunnel. 3 generations of his family had worked this land, believing they understood its rhythms and secrets. But all along, someone else had been there, hidden beneath the surface, taking what wasn't theirs to take. We need to find out who MLB is, or Tremendous. Jerome said, his jaw set with determination. And we need to know what exactly they're doing down here. Henry nodded, his eyes scanning the tunnel ahead where the mechanical hum seemed to grow slightly louder. Question is, do we keep going now or come back better prepared? Jerome considered the options. The tunnel clearly extended much farther than they had explored so far. The active machinery suggested that whoever was operating down here might have personnel present deeper in the system. Two men with flashlights and no weapons beyond a pocket knife weren't exactly prepared for a confrontation. Let's head back, he decided reluctantly. We know enough to start digging, the paper kind of digging. County records, property deeds, mineral rights. There's got to be a paper trail somewhere. Henry looked relieved. Smart move. Better to know what we're dealing with before we go any deeper. They made their way back carefully, marking their path with small scratches in the wall. The air felt even heavier on the return, as if the tunnel was reluctant to let them go. When they reached the rope, they climbed out in silence, their clothes and faces streaked with grime. The sulfur clung to them like an invisible warning. They sat on the tailgate of Henry's truck, sharing a bottle of water and watching the wind stir the grass around the hole. The mundane beauty of the farm, the swaying corn stalks, the distant lowing of cattle, the hawks circling lazily overhead, seemed surreal now, a peaceful facade concealing a dark secret. What do you think they were doing? Henry asked finally. Jerome shook his head. Something big? Maybe illegal? Maybe dangerous? You think it's oil? I don't know, but it ain't farming, and it sure as hell ain't natural. They watched the field for a long time, neither willing to say what they both knew. Something had changed. The land wasn't quiet anymore. It had secrets, old ones, buried deep. Before leaving, Jerome walked back to the hole. He stared down into it, flashlight off. There was movement inside, subtle and slow, like the earth breathing. He stepped back and returned to the truck. They drove away with the windows down, trying to rid themselves of the smell. But even as the farm shrank in the rearview mirror, Jerome couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't climbed out alone. Something was still with them, something that had waited a long time to be found. I need to know who MLB is, Jerome said as they pulled onto the main road, and I need to know what they're doing under my land. Henry nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Records office opens at 8 tomorrow. I know the clerk. She might be able to help us access the older archives. Jerome stared out the window at the passing fields, each one potentially hiding its own secrets beneath the surface. The world he'd known his entire life, the predictable rhythms of planting and harvest, the straightforward relationship between man and soil, had been fundamentally altered in the space of a day. Someone had stolen something from him, from his father, from his grandfather. Not just space beneath the earth, but truth, trust, the certainty that they knew the land they called home. And whoever they were still there, still operating, still violating the boundaries of ownership and honesty. Jerome set his jaw, a cold determination settling in his chest. He would find them, he would expose them, and he would reclaim what had been taken. Not just the physical space beneath his farm, but the truth that had been buried alongside it for generations. The land had finally spoken. Now it was his turn to respond. The county records office occupied the ground floor of a squat brick building on the edge of town, its peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights a testament to decades of budget cuts and municipal neglect. Inside, the air hung heavy with the smell of old paper and dust, a physical reminder of how rarely these archives were disturbed. Jerome arrived just as the doors opened, the weight of a sleepless night evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. The secrets beneath his land had robbed him of rest, his mind churning with questions that had no answers. Not yet. The clerk, a tired woman with half-moon glasses and a cardigan far too thick for the summer heat, recognized him immediately. Agnes Miller had been running the records office since Jerome was a teenager. Her hair had gone from auburn to steel gray, but her eyes still held the same efficient sharpness. Jerome Hale, she said, looking up from her computer. Don't often see farmers in here unless it's property tax season. What brings you to my little kingdom of forgotten paperwork? Jerome removed his hat, a gesture of respect ingrained since childhood. Need to look at some old records, Agnes. Land surveys, mineral rights, maybe some corporate filings from the 1960s. Agnes raised an eyebrow. That's specific and unusual. Something wrong with the farm? Not exactly wrong, Jerome said carefully. Just trying to clear up some historical questions about the land. Agnes studied him for a moment, then nodded. Records room is through there. Survey maps are in the cabinets along the west wall. Property deeds in the filing system by the window. Corporate filings would be in the state archives, but we keep local copies of anything involving the county properties. She paused, then added, if you tell me what you're looking for specifically, I might be able to help. Been here 43 years. Know these files better than my own kitchen cabinets. Jerome hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Agnes had known his father, had grown up in the same community. If anyone could be trusted with the strange discovery, it was her. Found something on my land, he said quietly, leaning closer to her desk. Something that shouldn't be there. A tunnel. Man-made. Looks industrial and old, but also active. Agnes's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or concern. When you say tunnel, she asked, her voice equally low, you mean like a storm drain or culvert? No, Jerome shook his head. I mean a full-size passage, big enough to walk through, going deep under my southern field, with equipment inside. Machinery. Agnes removed her glasses slowly, folding them with deliberate care. And you're sure this is on your property, not crossing over from adjacent land? Directly under my corn, land that's been in my family since 1931. Agnes nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Start with the survey maps, she said finally. I'll pull some files I think might help. The records room was a museum of bureaucratic history, row upon row of metal filing cabinets, shelves laden with bound volumes, and tables covered with maps in various states of preservation. Jerome made his way to the surveys section, where county properties were documented in meticulous detail. Every boundary and elevation change recorded for posterity and tax purposes. He found the drawer labeled Section 23, Hale Northby Wilson Properties, and began pulling maps chronologically, starting with the original survey from when his grandfather purchased the farm. The early maps showed nothing unusual, just the careful documentation of 150 acres of prime farmland, with notations about soil types, natural waterways, and elevation changes. But then, tucked between two fragile sheets of carbon paper, he found a survey from 1958. The map was crudely drawn, but Jerome recognized the shape of his southern field immediately. A black rectangle had been marked in ink near the base of the hill, labeled simply as Sector C. Below it, in faded type, was a note. Approved for exploratory shaft. Permit filed with tri-state extraction. His breath caught. Tri-state. The letters matched. Not perfectly, but close enough. MLB could have been a later name, a rebranding. Jerome made a copy of the document and continued searching, his fingers moving with greater urgency now. He found several more surveys from the early 1960s, each showing additional annotations to the southern field. Lines marking what appeared to be access routes, points labeled with alphanumeric codes, a notation about subsurface rights that referenced a document number he couldn't locate. Find anything helpful? Agnes asked, appearing beside him with a stack of folders. Jerome showed her the 1958 survey. Tri-state extraction. Ever heard of them? Agnes studied the map, her expression carefully neutral. Vaguely, they were around when I first started working here. Some kind of resource company, if I recall correctly. Owned by out-of-state interests. What kind of resources? Oil, I think. Maybe natural gas. They were doing exploratory work throughout the county in the late 50s, early 60s. She hesitated, then added, there were rumors, of course, small town, big company, always leads to talk. What kind of rumors? Agnes glanced toward the front desk, ensuring they were alone. That they weren't playing by the rules. That they were drilling in places they didn't have proper permits for. That they had connections in the state capital that let them operate creatively. She set down the folders she'd been carrying. These might interest you. Property assessments from 1960 through 1970 shows any officially recognized improvements or changes to the land, along with tax valuations. Jerome opened the top folder, revealing pages of typewritten assessments. His eyes scanned the entries until he found his family's name: Hale Property, 150-acre, agricultural, 1960. Assessment and land value, $24,500. Improvements, 8,750. Total, 33,250. 1961. Assessment, land value, 24,500. Improvements, 8,250. Total, 30,250. The values remained consistent until 1964, when a small but significant change appeared. 1964. Assessment, land value, 24,500. Improvements, 8,750. Mineral access easement, not taxable. State exemption number 4872. Total, 33,250. Mineral access easement, Jerome read aloud, his finger tracing the words. What the hell is that? Agnes shook her head. I've seen that designation before, usually on properties where oil or gas companies have negotiated drilling rights. But typically, the landowner would have signed an agreement and received compensation. My father never signed anything like that, Jerome said firmly. He would have told me, and there would have been money. He wouldn't have kept that quiet, not when we were struggling through the drought years. Maybe he didn't know, Agnes suggested quietly. Look at the notation, state exemption number 4872. That suggests it wasn't a voluntary easement negotiated with the landowner. It was something imposed by the state. Jerome felt a cold anger building in his chest. They just took it? Without asking? Without paying? It was a different time, Agnes said, not defending the practice but acknowledging the reality, especially for certain landowners. The implication hung in the air between them. Jerome's grandfather had been one of the few black farmers to own land in the county during the Depression. His father had continued that legacy through decades of barely disguised hostility from banks, suppliers, and sometimes neighbors. Both men had succeeded through a combination of extraordinary skill, relentless work ethic, and a stubborn refusal to be driven off their land. But they had still been black men in rural America, in an era when rights existed on paper but often evaporated in practice. You think they targeted our farm because they thought we couldn't fight back? Jerome asked, the question bitter on his tongue. Agnes sighed. I don't know, Jerome, but I do know that when big companies went looking for places to drill, or mine or dump waste, they typically didn't choose properties owned by people with political connections and expensive lawyers. Jerome continued through the assessment records, finding the same mineral access easement notation every year until 1975, when it abruptly disappeared without explanation. There was no record of the easement being terminated or transferred. It simply vanished from the official documentation. Just as Jerome was about to close the folder, a small slip of paper fell from between the pages. A newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, its edges crumbling. The headline read, Tri-State Extraction Acquired by Midland Boring and Logistics, Operations to Continue. The article was dated September 1972, and though brief, it contained a vital piece of information. The acquisition includes all assets and operations of Tri-State, including its exploratory initiatives in Colbert County. A representative for the new entity, which will operate under the MLB corporate designation, assured local officials that all existing arrangements will be honored. MLB Midland Boring and Logistics. Agnes, Jerome said, holding up the clipping, you ever heard of Midland Boring and Logistics? The clerk frowned, considering. Doesn't ring a bell. But then again, they might not have had much interaction with the county if they were just continuing existing operations. Jerome made copies of everything, the surveys, the assessments, the newspaper clipping. Each document was a piece of a puzzle he was only beginning to understand, the outline of a story that had been hidden from his family for generations. As he was preparing to leave, Agnes approached with one final folder. Found this in the back of the cabinet, she said. Might be nothing, but she handed him what appeared to be a complaint form filed with the county in 1970. The complainant's name was Thomas Hale, his father. The document was simple and straightforward, a formal objection to unauthorized activity on the Hale property property, specifically unidentified vehicles accessing the southern field during night hours and unusual sounds emanating from beneath the ground. The complaint had been acknowledged with a rubber stamp and a scrawled signature, but there was no record of any investigation or resolution. He knew, Jerome whispered, staring at his father's signature. He suspected something was happening. Looks like it, Agnes agreed, and looks like nobody did anything about it. Jerome felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. His father hadn't been ignorant of the violation occurring on his land. He had recognized it, had tried to challenge it through official channels. But like so many black farmers of his era, his concerns had been stamped, filed, and forgotten. Thank you, Agnes, Jerome said, gathering the copies into a folder. This helps. Agnes nodded, her expression solemn. Be careful, Jerome. These companies, they've had a long time to hide whatever they're doing. People who've had secrets for decades don't usually give them up easily. Jerome placed his hat back on his head, squaring his shoulders. My father tried to fight this through paperwork and proper channels. Look where that got him. I aim to try something different. As he walked back to his truck, the weight of history and injustice pressed down on him like a physical force. What had started as a mysterious discovery had become something far more personal, a decades-long violation that had been deliberately hidden from his family, a theft that extended beyond mere resources to include their very right to know what was happening on their own land. His next stop would be the County Historical Society, where the longer memory of the community was preserved not just in official documents, but in newspapers, photographs, and the recollections of those who had witnessed the county's transformation over decades. If Tri-State and MLB had been operating here since the 1950s, someone would remember. Someone would know what they had really been doing beneath his family's feet all these years. And Jerome intended to find them. The County Historical Society occupied a Victorian house on the edge of town, its gingerbread trim and wraparound porch a relic of a more prosperous era. Once the home of a prosperous merchant, the building now housed the collective memory of the community, rooms filled with artifacts, photographs, and documents that trace the county's evolution from frontier settlement to modern agricultural center. Jerome parked his truck beneath the sprawling oak that dominated the front yard, the folder of documents secure under his arm as he climbed the worn wooden steps to the porch. The door stood open as it always did during visiting hours, with only a screen door between the humid summer air and the climate-controlled interior. Hello, he called, stepping into the foyer where framed photographs of town founders lined the walls. Anyone here? In the back, came a thin voice from deeper in the house. In the research room. Jerome followed the sound, moving through rooms filled with glass display cases containing everything from Civil War uniforms to vintage farm implements to high school sports trophies. The research room occupied what had once been the dining room, its walls lined with bookshelves and file cabinets, its center dominated by a massive oak table scattered with papers and reference books. Arthur Langford sat at the table, his thin frame nearly skeletal, with skin like parchment and sharp blue eyes that held too much memory. The retired school teacher had been the county's unofficial historian for as long as Jerome could remember, collecting stories, photographs, and documents with the fervor of a man who understood that unrecorded history vanished like morning mist. Jerome Hale, Langford said, looking up from the ledger he'd been studying. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? Not often I get farmers in here unless they're researching family trees. Arthur, Jerome nodded in greeting. I'm looking for information about a company that operated in the county back in the 50s and 60s. Thought you might remember them or have some records. I remember just about everything and everybody from that era, Langford said with a thin smile. Blessing and curse of getting old. The past gets clearer while the present gets fuzzier. What company are you interested in? Tri-State Extraction, Jerome said, watching the old man's face carefully. Later became Midland Boring and Logistics. MLB for short. Something flickered in Langford's gaze. Recognition, certainly, but also something deeper. Concern, perhaps, or wariness. That name hasn't come up in a long time, Langford said softly, turning the survey map in his bony fingers. They were drilling here before the interstate came through. Quietly, no fanfare. Most folks didn't even know. My family didn't, Jerome said, the words sharp with accusation. Langford nodded. I'm not surprised. They didn't need to tell anyone. Back then, most of the black farmers didn't hold mineral rights to their land. Those were separate contracts, legalese buried in deeds signed under pressure or not signed at all. They'd claim it was part of the public trust or state reserves or federal interest. You could own the soil, but not what was under it. Jerome felt his jaw clench. So they just came and took it. They always do, Langford said, not unkindly. The old man led him to a filing cabinet in the back of the room and pulled out a folder marked in TSSE Corp. Inside were photocopies of newspaper clippings, corporate brochures, even a faded photograph of a drill site, mud-slicked ground, two white men in coveralls beside a vertical rig. In the background was a small house. Jerome leaned closer. It looked like his grandfather's cabin, long since demolished. The date on the photo read 1964. They operated under different names, Langford explained, spreading the materials across the table. Tri-State, Midland Extraction. Later, something called Kendrick's Energy. Always the same men, though. They'd open a shaft, pull what they could, then vanish before anyone noticed. Why hasn't anyone done anything? Jerome asked, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Langford offered a thin smile. Because no one who matters lost anything. The blunt assessment hung in the air, its truth undeniable. The company provided jobs. Not many, but enough to keep local officials happy. They paid some taxes, never what they should have, but enough to maintain political goodwill, and they were careful about whose land they exploited. Jerome examined another photograph, this one showing a group of men in suits standing beside a drilling rig. The caption identified them as Tri-State executives and State Geological Survey representatives touring new exploratory sites, 1962. They had government backing, he asked. Not officially, Langford said, but they had relationships, connections, people in positions to look the other way when permits weren't quite in order or when complaints were filed. The historian pulled out another document, a map of the county with colored markings indicating various properties. I made this myself years ago when I started noticing a pattern. The red marks show properties where Tri-State or its successors operated. Notice anything? Jerome studied the map. The red marks were scattered throughout the county, but with a clear pattern, they appeared almost exclusively on properties owned by black farmers, elderly widows, or immigrant families who had settled in the area after World War II. They targeted the vulnerable, Jerome said, the realization settling like a stone in his stomach. They targeted those who couldn't fight back effectively, Langford corrected. Business decision, pure and simple. Less resistance meant lower costs and fewer delays. And what exactly were they extracting, Jerome asked, though he already suspected the answer based on what he'd seen in the tunnel. Officially, natural gas and oil, small deposits, nothing major, but enough to be profitable if you weren't paying fair market rates for access. Langford hesitated, then added, unofficially, there were rumors about other activities. Some said they were tapping into deeper resources, rare earth minerals maybe. Others thought they might be using the tunnels for storage of materials that couldn't be kept above ground for regulatory reasons. Illegal dumping, you mean? Langford shrugged. Possibly. Or storage of industrial chemicals that had special handling requirements. Either way, the tunnel network they built was far more extensive than what would be needed for simple oil extraction. Jerome's mind flashed to the sophisticated construction they'd seen beneath his field, the reinforced walls, the electrical conduits, the organized storage areas. How big is this network? Langford pulled out another map, this one hand-drawn and marked with red lines that extended like veins through the county. This is my best guess based on reported activity, property records, and accounts from people who work for the company. If I'm right, they've built close to 30 miles of tunnels under this county alone, connecting various extraction sites and processing facilities. Jerome stared at the map in disbelief. The red lines formed an intricate web with several concentrated clusters that presumably represented major operational areas. One of those clusters sat directly beneath his farm and the surrounding properties. And all of this has been operating, what, 60 years, 70, without public knowledge? Not entirely without knowledge, Langford corrected. People knew something was happening. There were rumors, complaints, occasional news stories when something couldn't be ignored. An accident, a spill, a case of contaminated well water. But the company was adept at containing these incidents, settling with affected parties, ensuring that wider investigations didn't occur. The historian pulled out a thick file labeled Incidents and Complaints and opened it to reveal dozens of newspaper clippings, letters, and official reports. I've been collecting these for decades. Patterns emerge when you look at enough isolated incidents. One clipping caught Jerome's eye, a small article from 1975 headlined, "Local Farmer Reports Strange Activity on Southern Property." The farmer wasn't named, but the description of the location matched Jerome's land precisely. "That would have been my father," he said, pointing to the article. Langford nodded. Thomas was one of the few who spoke up publicly. Most didn't, either because they were intimidated or because they were compensated to keep quiet. "My father wasn't compensated," Jerome said firmly. "We would have known. We were struggling those years. Drought, equipment failures, bank loans with interest rates that seemed to rise every month. If he'd received any kind of payment, he would have used it." "Maybe the compensation wasn't financial," Langford suggested. "Maybe it was forbearance, a loan extension when it shouldn't have been granted, a tax assessment that mysteriously remained low when others were rising. The company had ways of applying both pressure and relief where needed." Jerome thought about his father's stoic determination during those difficult years, his insistence that they would weather the hard times through work and faith. Had there been moments of unexpected reprieve that he hadn't questioned? Problems that had resolved themselves too easily? "So what happened?" he asked. "The tunnels are still there, still active, but you said the company changed names, moved around." Langford nodded, flipping through his files until he found what he was looking for, a corporate registration form dated 1998. Kendrick's Energy. That's their current iteration, as far as I can tell. Still operating, still connected to the original Tri-State through a maze of acquisitions and subsidiaries, but effectively the same entity. And they're still, what, drilling, mining, whatever they're doing under my land. Based on their periodic filings with the state corporate registry, yes, they're still active, though the exact nature of their operations isn't specified in public documents. Langford closed the file, his expression grave. "What brought you here asking about them, Jerome, after all these years?" Jerome hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but Langford had been forthcoming with information that had clearly taken years to compile. He deserved honesty in return. "The earthquake," Jerome said finally. "It opened up a hole in my south field, exposed one of their tunnels. Henry and I went down there yesterday, saw the operation with our own eyes. It's extensive, industrial, active." Langford didn't look surprised. "I've been waiting for something like this to happen," he said quietly. "These tunnels were built decades ago, many of them using substandard materials or shortcuts to save costs. The company has maintained the critical infrastructure, but much of the network has been left to deteriorate." "You knew about this? All of it?" Jerome asked, a note of accusation creeping into his voice. "I suspected," Langford corrected. "I had pieces of the puzzle, documents, testimonies, patterns of activity, but I never had direct evidence, never saw the tunnels myself." He leaned forward, his eyes suddenly intense. "But you have. You've seen what they've built, what they're doing." Jerome nodded slowly. "I have, and I'm going to expose them." Langford's expression grew cautious. "Be careful, Jerome. These people have been operating in secret for decades. They've invested millions in this infrastructure. They won't simply walk away because one farmer has discovered their secret." "I'm not just one farmer," Jerome replied, steel entering his voice. "I'm the third generation of Hales to work that land, and I'm the first to know what's been stolen from beneath our feet. That changes everything." Langford studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "It does at that." He began gathering the materials they had reviewed, placing them carefully back into their folders. "Take copies of whatever you need, and—" He hesitated, then reached into his desk drawer and retrieved a business card. "This woman might be able to help, Kayla Springer. She's an environmental scientist with the State Research Station. Henry's niece, if I'm not mistaken." Jerome took the card, recognizing the name. Henry's mentioned her. Said she took on agrichem a few years back over pesticide runoff. And won, Langford added. She has expertise in soil contamination, groundwater pollution, and the regulatory frameworks that govern extraction industries. More importantly, she has connections with state environmental agencies and knows how to navigate the system. You think I'll need that kind of help? Langford's expression was solemn. I think you're about to challenge a very powerful entity that has operated with impunity for generations. They have lawyers, political connections, and resources you can't match alone. Yes, I think you'll need all the help you can get. Jerome pocketed the card, then gathered the copies of documents Langford had provided. Thank you, Arthur, for keeping these records, for caring about what happened. The old historian nodded. History isn't just dates and names, Jerome. It's patterns. It's power. It's understanding who could act with impunity and who had to bear the consequences. I keep these records because someone should remember the truth, even when it's inconvenient. As Jerome turned to leave, Langford called after him. One more thing. When you confront them, and I know you will, remember that you're not just fighting for your land. You're fighting for everyone whose voice was silenced, whose complaints were ignored, whose rights were violated. You're fighting a wrong that's larger than just your farm. Jerome nodded, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. I know, and I won't be fighting alone. He left the Historical Society with a clearer understanding of what he was facing, not just a violation of his property rights, but a systematic exploitation that had targeted the vulnerable throughout the county for decades. The enemy had a name now, Kendrick's Energy, and a history that revealed both their methods and their vulnerabilities. As he drove back toward his farm, Jerome thought about his father and grandfather, about the struggles they had endured to keep the land in the family. They had faced drought, flood, economic hardship, and racial prejudice, overcoming each challenge through determination and skill. Now it was his turn to fight a different kind of battle, one against a corporate entity that had operated in the shadows for generations, stealing resources from beneath the feet of those who worked the land above. This wasn't just about oil or gas or whatever they were extracting. It was about justice, long delayed but now within reach. He pulled over to the side of the road and took out his phone, dialing the number on Langford's card. It was time to bring in someone with the scientific expertise to document what was happening beneath his farm, someone who could translate what they found into the language of regulatory violations and environmental impact. It was time to bring in Kayla Springer. Kayla Springer's field station sat at the junction of Cottonwood Creek and Highway 23, a utilitarian complex of low buildings surrounded by experimental agricultural plots and environmental monitoring equipment. The main structure was a repurposed agricultural warehouse, its metal siding painted institutional green, with a small sign identifying it as the Eastern Regional Environmental Research Station. Jerome parked beside a row of mud-splattered government vehicles, noting the contrast between their practical functionality and the sleek black SUV at the end of the row, clearly not standard issue for state scientists. Henry was already waiting for him, by him leaning against the hood of his truck, a folder of documents tucked under his arm. She's expecting us, Henry said by way of greeting. Said she could give us an hour before her afternoon field sampling. You told her what this is about? Jerome asked as they walked toward the entrance. Henry shook his head. Just said we needed her expertise on a potential environmental issue on your property. Figured the details were better shared in person. The interior of the station was a stark contrast to its mundane exterior. A modern laboratory space filled with sophisticated analytical equipment, computer workstations, and walls of environmental monitoring data displayed on large screens. Half a dozen scientists in casual field clothes moved between workstations, examining samples or analyzing data. Kayla met them at the entrance to the main lab, clipboard in hand, her professional demeanor softened by a genuine smile for her uncle. At 34, she carried herself with the confident authority of someone who had earned her position through competence rather than connections. Her dark hair was pulled into a practical bun, and her eyes, sharp and observant behind rimless glasses, missed nothing as she assessed the two men. Uncle Henry, she said warmly, embracing him briefly before turning to Jerome. And Mr. Hale, I've heard a lot about your farm over the years. Just Jerome, please, he said, shaking her offered hand. Thank you for making time to see us. Of course, family emergency, Uncle Henry said, though he was light on the details. She led them through the lab to a small conference room at the back, closing the door behind them. So, what's this environmental issue we need to discuss? Jerome exchanged a glance with Henry, then decided directness was the best approach. There's a tunnel system under my farm. Industrial scale. Been there for decades, apparently. Still active. We think they're extracting oil or gas, maybe other resources, without permission or compensation. If Kayla was surprised by this revelation, she didn't show it. Instead, she pulled a legal pad from her clipboard and began taking notes. When you say tunnel system, you're talking about something man-made, not natural caves or karst formations? Definitely man-made, Henry confirmed. Reinforced walls, electrical systems, what looked like drainage infrastructure. This is engineered, not geological. And you've physically seen this yourselves? Kayla asked, her pen moving across the page in quick, efficient strokes. Jerome nodded. The earthquake opened up access to one of the tunnels. Henry and I went down yesterday to investigate. Saw enough to know this is a major operation, not some abandoned historical remnant. How deep? Maybe 30, 40 feet to the tunnel floor, Jerome estimated, though the system itself seems to extend much deeper in places. And you observed signs of current activity, recent human presence, operational machinery? All of the above, Henry said. Footprints in the mud, equipment that looked well maintained. We heard machinery running deeper in the system. Kayla's expression remained professionally neutral, but her eyes had sharpened with interest. Did you identify any corporate markers, logos, signage, anything to indicate who's operating down there? Jerome pulled out the documents he'd collected from his research. We found a partial name burned into a wooden beam, MLB. Through county records and the Historical Society, I've traced it to a company called Midland Boring and Logistics, which was previously Tri-State Extraction and is now apparently operating as Kendrick's Energy. Kayla's pen stopped moving. Kendrick's? You're certain? According to the county historian, yes. Why? You know them? A tight smile crossed Kayla's face. We've had some interactions. They operate several facilities in the region, mostly focused on oil and gas extraction from what they call marginal deposits, resources too limited to justify conventional drilling operations, but still profitable with the right extraction methods. Like tunnels under private property? Henry asked dryly. Precisely like that, Kayla agreed, though I've never seen documentation of an operation as extensive as what you're describing. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the legal pad. This could be significant, both environmentally and legally. Underground extraction operations have to comply with state and federal regulations regarding groundwater protection, soil stability, emissions control, and dozens of other parameters. From what we saw, Jerome said, I doubt they're checking many regulatory boxes down there. We'll need evidence, Kayla said, shifting into a more focused mode. Photographs, soil samples, water samples, air quality readings, documentation of the tunnel construction, the extraction equipment, any visible corporate identifiers. That's why we came to you, Henry said. We need someone who knows what to look for, what to document, and how to use that information effectively. Kayla nodded, already making a list on her pad. I can help with that. I have portable sampling equipment, cameras designed for low-light conditions, and experience documenting environmental violations for potential enforcement actions. She paused, studying them both. But you should understand what you're potentially getting into. Kendrick's isn't some small-time operation. They have political connections, legal resources, and a history of aggressive responses to challenges. I'm not concerned about their connections, Jerome said firmly. They've been stealing from beneath my family's feet for over 60 years. That ends now. Kayla studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right. When do you want to do this? As soon as possible, Jerome replied. The tunnel is exposed now, but there's no guarantee it will stay that way. For all we know, they might already be aware of the breach and working to seal it. Tomorrow morning, then, Kayla decided. I can assemble the equipment today and be at your farm at dawn. Early morning gives us the best chance of avoiding any workers who might be in the tunnels. There's one more thing you should know, Jerome said, hesitating slightly. The historian Langford, he believes this tunnel system might extend far beyond my property. He showed us maps suggesting a network that could run beneath multiple farms in the area, possibly throughout the entire county. Kayla's eyebrows rose. If that's true, we're looking at something far larger than a single unauthorized extraction operation. We could be dealing with a decades-long pattern of environmental and property rights violations affecting dozens, maybe hundreds of landowners. That's my understanding, Jerome confirmed. But right now, all I can prove is what's happening under my land. Then that's where we start, Kayla said decisively. Document one case thoroughly, establish the corporate connection conclusively, then use that as leverage to investigate the broader pattern. She turned to a fresh page on her legal pad. Tell me everything you observed in the tunnel. Dimensions, construction materials, environmental conditions, any signs of specific extraction activities. For the next 30 minutes, Jerome and Henry recounted their exploration in detail, describing the tunnel's construction, the evidence of ongoing operations, and the strange environmental conditions they'd encountered. Kayla took meticulous notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific details, the color and consistency of liquids they'd observed, the type of machinery they'd heard, the structural composition of the tunnel walls. As they finished their account, Kayla reviewed her notes with a frown. Based on what you're describing, particularly the smell and the oily residue, I'm almost certain they're extracting petroleum. But the scale and method you're describing is unusual. Conventional oil extraction doesn't typically involve extensive tunnel networks. It's inefficient compared to directional drilling. Could they be doing something else down there, Henry asked? Something beyond just oil extraction? Possibly, Kayla acknowledged. The infrastructure you're describing seems more elaborate than would be needed for simple resource extraction. They might be using the tunnels for multiple purposes: extraction, transportation, storage, maybe even processing. Or hiding something they don't want found, Jerome suggested. Kayla nodded slowly. That's also a possibility. Industrial operations often generate waste that's difficult or expensive to dispose of properly. Underground storage can be a way to avoid regulatory oversight and disposal costs. She began sketching a rough map of the tunnel system based on their descriptions, marking the areas they had explored and the directions where they had observed the network extending. Tomorrow we'll focus on documenting this section first, she said, circling the area nearest the surface breach. Then, if conditions permit, we'll explore deeper to try to determine the full extent of the operation. Will just the three of us be enough? Jerome asked. This feels like something that might need more people, more resources. For now, yes, Kayla said firmly. Until we know exactly what we're dealing with, it's better to keep this contained. If Kendricks gets wind that their operation has been exposed, they might take steps to destroy evidence or seal off access. She hesitated, then added, they might also take more direct action to protect their interests. You mean they might be dangerous, Henry stated flatly. I mean they have billions of dollars of infrastructure and decades of operations they'd want to protect, Kayla replied carefully. I've dealt with them professionally through my environmental monitoring work. They're aggressive, litigious, and not particularly ethical. I wouldn't put anything past them if they felt truly threatened. The warning hung in the air, its implications clear. This wasn't just about documenting an environmental violation or seeking compensation for unauthorized use of resources. They were potentially challenging a powerful entity that had operated in the shadows for generations, an entity that might go to extreme lengths to maintain those shadows. We understand the risks, Jerome said after a moment, but this needs to be done. They've taken enough. Kayla studied him, then nodded. All right, I'll bring everything we need for a thorough documentation operation. Cameras, sample collection kits, air quality monitors, the works. We'll get you the evidence you need to take action. What kind of action are we talking about exactly? Henry asked. Legal, regulatory, public exposure? All of the above, potentially, Kayla said. My expertise is in environmental science and regulatory frameworks. I can help document violations and navigate the enforcement process through state agencies. But you might also want to consider legal representation for property rights issues and possibly media contacts for public exposure if the official channels aren't responsive. One step at a time, Jerome said. First, we document what's down there. Then we decide how to proceed. As they prepared to leave, Kayla pulled a small business card from her pocket and handed it to Jerome. This is my personal cell number. If you notice any changes at the tunnel entrance or any unusual activity on your property before tomorrow, call me immediately. Jerome pocketed the card. You think they might already know? I think it's better to be cautious, Kayla replied. A company that's managed to keep an operation like this secret for decades probably has systems in place to detect breaches. Just be alert. Outside in the parking lot, Jerome and Henry lingered by their trucks, processing everything they had learned and the implications of the path they were now committed to. Your niece is impressive, Jerome said. Didn't flinch when we told her about underground tunnels and corporate conspiracies. Henry smiled with obvious pride. Kayla's seen plenty in her line of work. Takes more than a secret tunnel to rattle her. She seems to know Kendricks pretty well. Had some run-ins with them over water quality issues a few years back, Henry explained. One of their conventional drilling operations was contaminating a watershed she was monitoring. She pushed for enforcement, they pushed back. Hard. Tried to discredit her research, pressured her supervisors, even filed complaints with the state licensing board. But she won? Eventually, cost her professionally though. Certain doors closed, certain projects became unavailable. She's tough, but she knows the price of challenging companies like Kendricks. Jerome nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. And she's still willing to help us. Family, Henry said simply, and she believes in doing what's right. Consequences be damned. Gets that from her grandmother, my mother. Woman never backed down from a fight in her life. As Jerome drove back toward his farm, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the fields, he thought about the risks they were taking and the forces they were challenging. Kayla's warnings about Kendrick's resources and ruthlessness hadn't deterred him. If anything, they had strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about his land anymore. It was about decades of exploitation that had targeted the vulnerable and marginalized. It was about a company that had operated with impunity, secure in the belief that their victims couldn't or wouldn't fight back effectively. They had chosen the wrong farmer to exploit, and tomorrow they would begin to understand exactly what that meant. Dawn broke across the Hale farm in a wash of pale gold, illuminating dew-heavy fields in the jagged wound in the earth where the tunnel had been exposed. Jerome had been awake for hours, checking and rechecking the perimeter of his property, watching for any sign that Kendricks had discovered their secret was no longer secure. The night had passed without incident. No unusual vehicles on the road, no unfamiliar sounds from the direction of the breach, nothing to indicate that the company was aware of their discovery. But the normal rhythms of the farm had been disrupted. The cattle remained clustered at the far northern fence line, as far from the tunnel entrance as they could get. Buck refused to approach the southern field at all, standing at its edge with hackles raised, growling at something only he could sense. Kayla arrived precisely at 5:30 a.m., her government-issued SUV loaded with equipment cases, sample containers, and monitoring devices. Henry followed 10 minutes later, bringing additional ropes, stronger flashlights, and 3 sets of protective coveralls. We should treat this as a potentially hazardous environment, Kayla explained as she distributed breathing masks and nitrile gloves from her kit. Based on your descriptions of the smell and the oily residue, we could be dealing with petroleum products, industrial chemicals, or gases that could be harmful with prolonged exposure. She opened another case to reveal what looked like a handheld radar gun with a digital display. This is a multi-parameter air quality monitor. It can detect volatile organic compounds, methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon monoxide, and other common industrial gases. I'll be taking readings throughout our exploration. How long can we safely stay down there? Jerome asked, eyeing the protective gear. Depends on what we find, Kayla replied honestly. These masks will filter particulates and some gas concentrations, but they're not self-contained breathing apparatus. If the monitor shows dangerous levels of anything, we leave immediately. They approached the tunnel entrance cautiously, each carrying equipment suited to their role in the expedition. Kayla's backpack was filled with scientific instruments in sample collection containers. Henry carried a camera with a powerful flash attachment and a rangefinder to measure dimensions. Jerome brought tools, a crowbar, wire cutters, and a small pry bar, in case they encountered obstacles. The descent was more controlled than their previous exploration, with proper climbing harnesses secured to Henry's truck axle. Kayla went first, her headlamp cutting through the darkness as she methodically tested each handhold and foothold before committing her weight. Jerome followed, then Henry, each moving with the careful deliberation of people entering hostile territory. At the bottom, Kayla immediately activated her air monitor, watching the digital readouts with professional focus. Oxygen levels acceptable, carbon monoxide minimal, VOC levels elevated but below immediate danger thresholds, methane present but not at explosive concentrations. She made notes on a waterproof tablet, recording baseline conditions for later comparison. The air quality deteriorated the deeper we went last time, Jerome warned. Got harder to breathe, smell got stronger. Kayla nodded. We'll monitor continuously. If anything approaches dangerous levels, we turn back immediately. The tunnel stretched before them, its dimensions even more impressive in the improved lighting they'd brought. Kayla took measurements and photographs of the construction, paying particular attention to the reinforcement methods and materials used. This is sophisticated engineering, she noted, examining one of the support structures. These aren't temporary shoring techniques. This was built for long-term use, decades at minimum. She collected soil samples from the walls at regular intervals, carefully labeling each container with location coordinates from a handheld GPS unit. The soil composition changes as we go deeper, she observed. More clay content, different mineral profiles. I'll need to analyze these in the lab to understand the full environmental implications. They proceeded deeper into the tunnel, following the path Jerome and Henry had explored previously. When they reached the area with the strange geometric patterns in the walls, Kayla stopped to take extensive photographs and samples. These aren't random, she confirmed, tracing one of the patterns with a gloved finger. They appear to be purposeful conduits or channels of some kind, possibly for drainage, maybe for instrumentation or monitoring equipment. Can you tell what they're made of? Henry asked, shining his light along one of the darker veins that pulsed through the wall. Kayla carefully scraped a small sample into a sterile container. Not without analysis, but the texture suggests a composite material, possibly a polymer mixed with conductive elements. It's sophisticated, whatever it is. As they moved deeper, the environmental conditions began to change just as Jerome had described. The temperature rose noticeably, the air became thicker with moisture and chemical odors, and the walls seemed to sweat with a substance that wasn't quite water. Kayla checked her monitor frequently, frowning at the readings. VOC levels are rising, still within acceptable short-term exposure limits, but definitely concerning. Sulfur compounds are increasing too. They reached the area where Jerome and Henry had found the charred beam with the MLBCO marking. Kayla documented it thoroughly, taking multiple photographs from different angles and collecting samples of the burned wood. This is excellent evidence, she said, carefully securing the samples. The marking provides a direct link to Midland Boring and Logistics, which we can connect to Kendrick's through corporate filings. Beyond the marked beam, they entered territory Jerome and Henry hadn't previously explored. The tunnel widened into what appeared to be a junction, with 3 separate passages branching off in different directions. The walls here were more heavily reinforced, with metal plating covering sections of the ceiling and floor. Which way? Henry asked, shining his light down each passage in turn. Kayla consulted her air monitor. The southern passage shows higher VOC readings, which suggests it might lead toward active operations. That's probably our best bet for documenting current activities. They chose the southern route, moving more cautiously now that they were in unfamiliar territory. The passage sloped downward at a gentle angle, taking them deeper beneath the earth. The construction became more sophisticated, with proper flooring replacing the packed dirt of the earlier sections and electrical conduits running along the ceiling. Look, Jerome said, pointing to a junction box mounted on the wall. That's new wiring, modern. Kayla examined it without touching. Standard industrial electrical infrastructure, rated for hazardous environments. This is actively maintained, not abandoned legacy equipment. 100 yards further, they encountered their first definitive evidence of petroleum extraction, a collection point where several small pipes converged into a larger one, with a pressure gauge and control valve monitoring the flow. A small amount of dark liquid had leaked onto the floor beneath the junction, forming an oily puddle. Kayla carefully collected samples of the liquid, her expression grim. Crude oil, almost certainly, and based on the infrastructure, this is a collection node for what's likely a much larger extraction network. She photographed the equipment from multiple angles, ensuring that manufacturer markings and serial numbers were clearly visible. These components have date codes, she noted, pointing to the small stamped numbers on one of the valves. This particular piece was manufactured in 2018. This isn't old equipment, it's recent installation. They continued deeper, documenting similar collection nodes at regular intervals. The air quality deteriorated further, prompting Kayla to check her monitor with increasing frequency. "We should consider turning back soon," she warned. "These readings are approaching levels I'm not comfortable with for prolonged exposure." "Just a little further," Jerome urged. "I want to see where these pipes lead." Around the next bend, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber that stopped them in their tracks. Unlike the rough-hewn passages they had been following, this was a proper underground facility, a room approximately 30 feet square, with concrete flooring, proper lighting fixtures, currently inactive, and what appeared to be a small control station positioned against the far wall. "This is a monitoring substation," Kayla said, approaching the control panel cautiously. "They use these to regulate pressure, flow rates, and composition for pipeline operations." The control panel featured a display screen, currently dark, and several gauges showing pressure readings for different sections of the system. A logbook sat open beside the main console, its pages filled with handwritten entries. "Recent activity," Jerome said, pointing to the last entry, dated just 3 days earlier. "Someone was down here checking readings before the earthquake." Kayla photographed the logbook pages without touching them, ensuring that dates, times, and notations were clearly visible. "This is incredibly valuable evidence," she said. "It proves current, active operations with specific dates and operational parameters." As they examined the substation, a low, mechanical hum became audible from somewhere deeper in the system. It was rhythmic and steady, the sound of machinery in active operation. "That's what we heard before," Henry said quietly. "Only it's louder now. Closer." Kayla checked her monitor again, her expression growing concerned. "Methane levels are rising, not immediately dangerous, but heading in that direction. We should start back." Jerome nodded reluctantly. They had found what they came for, concrete evidence of an active extraction operation, complete with modern equipment, maintenance records, and direct corporate identifiers. But the sound of that machinery pulled at him, tempting him to push just a little further to see exactly what they were doing beneath his land. "One more passage," he said, pointing to a corridor leading away from the substation. "The sound is coming from there." "Jerome," Henry warned, "we got what we need. Don't push our luck." But Jerome was already moving toward the passage, drawn by the need to see the full extent of what had been hidden from him and his family for decades. Kayla and Henry exchanged glances, then followed, unwilling to let him proceed alone. The passage beyond the substation was different from the others, more finished, with proper lighting fixtures at regular intervals and what appeared to be ventilation ducts running along the ceiling. The mechanical hum grew louder as they advanced, resolving into the distinctive sound of pumps and compressors in operation. After approximately 50 yards, they reached another junction where the passage split into 3 branches. The center route was wider than the others, with what appeared to be rail tracks embedded in the floor, a small transport system for moving equipment or materials through the tunnel network. "This is bigger than I thought," Henry murmured, his voice barely audible over the machinery sounds. "This isn't just tapping a few oil deposits. This is a full-scale underground industrial operation." Kayla's air monitor emitted a soft but insistent beeping. "Methane and VOC levels continuing to rise," she reported. "We really should head back now." Jerome nodded, finally convinced. They had seen enough to understand the scale of what they were dealing with. Not just a simple tunnel or exploratory shaft, but an elaborate underground infrastructure built for long-term resource extraction on an industrial scale. As they turned to retrace their steps, A new sound reached them. Voices, distant but growing clearer, coming from one of the side passages. Human presence, approaching their position. Back, Henry whispered urgently. Now. They retreated quickly but quietly, retracing their path to the monitoring substation and then beyond, moving with greater urgency as the voices behind them grew louder. Whoever was in the tunnel was headed in their direction, perhaps responding to sensors or security systems they had triggered without realizing. Different route, Kayla suggested when they reached the three-way junction they had passed earlier. If they're coming from the South Passage, we should take the east to avoid them. They changed course, taking the eastern tunnel which sloped upward slightly, potentially leading toward the surface. This passage was less finished than the ones they had been following, with rougher walls and fewer support structures, suggesting it might be older or less frequently used. The gamble paid off. The voices faded behind them as they moved deeper into the eastern tunnel, eventually disappearing entirely. But they were now in unfamiliar territory, following a passage that hadn't been part of their original exploration. We need to find a way back to our entry point, Jerome said, trying to maintain his mental map of their route. Kayla consulted her GPS unit, frowning at the display. Signal's weak down here, but if I'm reading this correctly, we're moving on a roughly parallel track to our original path. If this tunnel maintains its current direction, it should eventually bring us close to where we started. They continued forward, the passage gradually narrowing and becoming less refined in its construction. The air quality improved slightly, the heavy chemical smell receding as they moved away from the active extraction areas. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 20 minutes, they reached another junction. This one appeared older, with wooden support beams instead of metal reinforcement and walls that showed signs of natural erosion rather than engineered design. I think we're in an older section of the network, Kayla observed. Possibly the original tunnels from the early extraction efforts in the 1950s or 60s. Which way now? Henry asked, his flashlight beam swinging between three potential paths. Kayla studied her partially functional GPS, then pointed to the rightmost passage. That direction should take us closest to our entry point, assuming the tunnel doesn't curve significantly. How about they followed her guidance, moving through what was clearly a much older section of the tunnel system. Here, the engineering was more primitive, the support structures showing their age through rust and decay. In places, the ceiling had partially collapsed, forcing them to navigate around fallen debris. Look at this, Henry said, pointing his light at a section of wall where ancient equipment had been abandoned in place. Drill bits, pipe sections, and what appeared to be parts of an old pump mechanism, all left behind when operations moved to newer, more sophisticated areas of the network. Kayla photographed the abandoned equipment, particularly focusing on any visible manufacturer markings or date stamps that might help establish the timeline of operations. This helps build our case, she said, shows the historical continuity of the operation, connecting the old tri-state activities to the current Kendrick's infrastructure. As they pressed on, the tunnel began to show signs of approaching the surface. Root systems penetrating the ceiling, increased moisture seeping through the walls, and slightly fresher air despite the continuing chemical undertones. We must be getting close to an exit, Jerome said hopefully. Air's changing. After another 100 yards, they found what they were looking for, a vertical shaft with metal rungs embedded in the wall, leading upward toward what appeared to be a trapdoor or hatch in the ceiling. This could be our way out, Henry said, testing the lowest rung with his weight. Seems solid enough. Where do you think it leads? Jerome asked, shining his light upward. We could be anywhere by now. Kayla checked her GPS one last time. Signal's still weak, but if this is accurate, we're close to the northern edge of your property, Jerome, near the old woodlot. Jerome nodded, visualizing the location. That makes sense. There's an old equipment shed up there that hasn't been used in years. Perfect place to hide an access point. Henry went first, climbing the metal rungs with careful deliberation, testing each one before trusting it with his full weight. When he reached the top, he pushed against the trap door, which resisted briefly before giving way with a groan of rusted hinges. Clear, he called down softly. It's inside a building of some kind. No one around. Jerome followed, then Kayla, each emerging into what was indeed the interior of the old equipment shed, a structure Jerome had assumed was merely abandoned storage, but now understood to be a disguised access point to the tunnel system. The shed looked ordinary enough from inside, tools hanging on walls, old farm equipment gathering dust in corners. Nothing to suggest its secret purpose, except for the trap door now standing open in the concrete floor. They hid this well, Jerome said, looking around with new eyes at the familiar structure. I've been in here dozens of times over the years. Never suspected a thing. That was the point, Kayla said, securing her sample case. Hidden in plain sight, using existing structures to disguise access points. They closed the trap door and concealed it as they had found it, beneath an old tarp covered with miscellaneous tools and equipment parts. From the outside, the shed looked unchanged, just another aging outbuilding on a working farm, its secrets once again hidden from casual observation. As they walked back toward the main farmhouse, the morning sun now fully risen and casting long shadows across the fields, they were silent, each processing what they had discovered beneath the seemingly ordinary landscape. The scale of the operation, its sophistication and historical continuity, the resources that must have been invested over decades, all of it pointed to a level of exploitation far beyond what they had initially imagined. We have what we need, Kayla said finally as they reached their vehicles. Samples, photographs, documentation of active operations with current date stamps, plus direct corporate identifiers linking everything to Kendrick's Energy. What happens now? Jerome asked, the reality of challenging such a massive, entrenched operation beginning to sink in. Now I analyze these samples in my lab, document everything properly, and prepare reports that can be submitted to regulatory agencies. Kayla's expression was determined. This is just the beginning, but it's a strong beginning. We have concrete evidence of unauthorized extraction activities, potential environmental violations, and corporate identifiers that create a clear chain of responsibility. Jerome nodded, gazing out over his fields, seeing them differently now that he understood what lay beneath. The land he had worked his entire life, that his father and grandfather had tended before him, had been violated in ways he was only beginning to understand. But now they had evidence. Now they could fight back. Thank you, he said simply, looking from Kayla to Henry, for helping me uncover the truth. This isn't just about your land, Jerome, Kayla replied. If what we saw down there is any indication, this operation extends far beyond your property. What we've uncovered could have implications for the entire county, maybe beyond. As they prepared to part ways, Henry placed a hand on Jerome's shoulder. You should stay somewhere else for a few days, he suggested quietly, until we know how Kendricks might react when they realize their operation has been exposed. Jerome shook his head firmly. This is my land. I'm not leaving it. At least consider it, Kayla urged. Companies like Kendricks don't maintain operations of this scale and secrecy without being willing to protect their investments. Once they realize someone has discovered their tunnels and documented their activities, they might take countermeasures. Let them, Jerome said, his jaw set with determination. I've spent my life working this land. I'm not about to abandon it now that I know what's really been happening here. If Kendricks wants to come after me, they'll find I'm not as easy to intimidate as they might expect. The declaration hung in the air, both a promise and a challenge. The battle lines had been drawn, evidence collected, and truth uncovered. What remained now was the confrontation that had been building for 60 years, a reckoning between those who had taken without permission and the man who had finally discovered the theft. And Jerome Hale was ready. By late afternoon, as Jerome was feeding the cattle near the eastern fence line, he felt it first as a vibration underfoot, then as a deep, unnatural rumble that rose from the earth like thunder in the bones. The cows grew agitated, turning in place, lowing anxiously. One of them backed into the fence, snapping a wooden post clean in half. Jerome dropped the feed bucket and turned toward the southern field. The sound intensified, louder now, a roaring pulse that grew and grew until it became a sudden explosion, sharp, violent, and close. The ground shook beneath him. He staggered, catching himself against the fence, eyes wide as a column of black smoke shot into the sky from beyond the tree line at the far end of the field. A second later came the wind, a hot, rushing wave that carried with it dust, debris, and a foul stench that coated his tongue and burned his throat. Buck raced toward him from the porch, barking frantically, fur raised along his spine. Easy, boy, Jerome murmured, though his own heart hammered against his ribs. Easy. The smoke column twisted skyward, thick and oily, staining the late afternoon blue with a vicious black smear. Jerome knew exactly what it meant. Someone had discovered their intrusion and was eliminating evidence, destroying the tunnel entrance, sealing off access, burying the truth beneath more rubble and soil. He ran. He reached the hill just as a second, smaller blast shook the earth again, this one muffled, but no less devastating. The trees near the edge of the field were bent at odd angles, their roots torn from the soil. The grass was flattened in a perfect arc around a new crater. The earth had collapsed inward, swallowing part of the ridge, and in the center of the blast zone was a twisted heap of metal piping and machinery, still steaming. He stood there staring until a piece of red plastic fluttered past his feet. He caught it without thinking. It was thin, like packaging the material, but printed across its surface in bold black letters were three unmistakable characters: TNT. It hadn't been a natural collapse. It had been sabotage, deliberate destruction, evidence elimination. Jerome's hands curled into fists. His chest rose and fell with short, shallow breaths. They had detonated part of the tunnel, destroyed evidence, and nearly taken out his land along with it. The rage that filled him then was quiet, cold, and absolute. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation. Whoever these people were, they were dangerous, and they were desperate. He pulled out his phone and took photographs of everything: the crater, the smoke column still rising, the bent trees, the metal debris, and especially the TNT wrapper. Then he called Henry. "They blew it," he said without preamble when his friend answered. "The tunnel entrance used explosives. Professional job." Henry's voice was tight with alarm. "Anyone hurt?" "No. I was over by the east pasture. But it was close, Henry. Too close. I'm on my way. Don't touch anything." "And Jerome?" "Yeah. Watch your back. If they're willing to set off explosives on your property in broad daylight, there's no telling what else they might do." Jerome ended the call and dialed Kayla next, giving her the same information in clipped, precise sentences. She responded with professional calm, asking detailed questions about the nature of the explosion, the debris pattern, and any chemical smells or residues he could detect. "This is actually helpful for our case," she said, surprising him. "Deliberate destruction of evidence shows consciousness of guilt, and using explosives on private property without permission adds several serious violations to the list. I'm heading back to you now. Don't disturb the site if possible." As he waited for them to arrive, Jerome walked the perimeter of the blast zone, careful not to enter the area directly affected, but taking more photographs from different angles. The explosion had been precisely targeted, just large enough to collapse the tunnel entrance and destroy any evidence near the surface, but controlled enough not to cause wider damage to the surrounding property. This wasn't the work of amateurs. Whoever had planted those charges knew exactly what they were doing, had calculated the precise force needed to eliminate the evidence while minimizing collateral damage. Military precision, professional expertise. Henry's truck arrived in a spray of gravel, his tires skidding slightly as he braked hard at the edge of the field. He emerged with a grim expression, surveying the scene with the experienced eye of a man who had seen explosives in action before. "Shaped charges," he said after a brief examination of the blast pattern. "Military grade, designed to direct the force downward, collapse the tunnel from above." He pointed to the debris pattern. "See how everything was driven inward? That's deliberate. They wanted to seal it, not just destroy it." Jerome handed him the TNT wrapper. "Found this. Blew right to me, like it was delivering a message." Henry examined it, his expression darkening. Commercial blasting material, not something civilians can just buy at the hardware store. This is controlled, regulated stuff. "Which means whoever did this has connections," Jerome concluded. "Access to restricted materials." "Or they are the authorities," Henry suggested quietly. "Military, maybe former military working private now. Someone with the right credentials to acquire this kind of material legally." The implication hung between them. If Kendricks had people with that kind of background and access, they were dealing with a far more sophisticated operation than they had initially realized. Kayla arrived 30 minutes later, her SUV loaded with additional sampling equipment. She approached the blast site methodically, first taking air samples from the periphery, then soil samples at regular intervals moving toward the center. She photographed everything, measured blast radius dimensions, and collected fragments of debris that might help identify the specific explosives used. This is professional work, she confirmed after completing her initial assessment. Precisely calculated yield, shaped charges placed at structural weak points for maximum effectiveness with minimum surface disruption. She held up a small fragment of metal with a partial serial number visible. This is military-grade hardware, not something you pick up at the local quarry supply shop. Can you trace it? Jerome asked. Possibly. Serial numbers are regulated. If we can reconstruct enough of this one, we might be able to track the purchase or at least the authorized user. She sealed the fragment in an evidence bag, labeling it carefully. But the bigger question is how they knew to do this now, today. The timing is too perfect to be coincidence. Jerome hadn't considered that aspect, but now it seemed obvious. The explosion had occurred less than 6 hours after they had explored the tunnel system, documenting its contents and collecting evidence. Someone had known about their intrusion, had responded with immediate and decisive action to eliminate access and destroy evidence. They're monitoring the tunnels, Henry said, giving voice to Jerome's thoughts. Sensors, cameras, motion detectors, something alerted them to our presence. Or they have someone watching the farm, Jerome suggested, scanning the distant tree lines and road with new suspicion. Someone who saw us enter this morning and reported back. Either way, Kayla said, they know we've been down there. They know we've seen what they're doing. And they're clearly willing to take extreme measures to protect their operation. She looked at Jerome with concern. You shouldn't stay here tonight. It's not safe. Jerome shook his head firmly. This is my home. I'm not leaving. Jerome, Henry began, but Jerome cut him off with a raised hand. No, I understand the risk. But if I leave now, I'm giving them exactly what they want. A clear field to operate without witnesses. I'm staying right here on my land where I can see what they do next. Kayla and Henry exchanged glances, recognizing the futility of arguing further. Jerome Hale was not a man easily moved once his mind was set. At least let me stay too, Henry offered. Safety in numbers. Jerome nodded, grateful for the support. Appreciate that. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the blast crater, they gathered on Jerome's porch to assess their situation and plan their next steps. Kayla had collected all the physical evidence she could from the explosion site, carefully packaged and labeled for analysis at her lab. She spread photographs across the porch table, creating a visual record of everything they had documented both in the tunnel and at the blast site. Here's where we stand, she said, professional and focused despite the gravity of the situation. We have solid evidence of an unauthorized extraction operation beneath your property, with clear corporate identifiers linking it to Kendrick's Energy. We have documentation of active current operations, not just historical infrastructure. And now we have evidence of deliberate destruction using regulated explosives, which adds criminal dimensions to what was already a serious civil and regulatory violation. What's our next move? Jerome asked, studying the photographs spread before him. We need to secure what we've collected, Kayla replied. These samples, these photographs, they're our leverage. I'll take them to my lab tonight, analyze what I can immediately, and secure the rest in our evidence storage facility where Kendricks can't reach them. Then what? Henry asked. Go to the authorities? Kayla hesitated, choosing her words carefully. We need to be strategic about which authorities we approach. Local law enforcement might have existing relationships with Kendricks, financial ties, personal connections. The sheriff's department budget depends partly on tax revenue from businesses operating in the county. You're saying they might not help, Jerome translated bluntly. I'm saying we should consider multiple paths forward, Kayla corrected. State environmental agencies, federal regulatory bodies, possibly independent media. We need to create enough public awareness and official scrutiny that Kendricks can't simply bury this, literally or figuratively. That night, sleep proved elusive for Jerome. He lay awake in his bedroom, listening to the night sounds of the farm, so familiar after decades, yet somehow altered now by the knowledge of what lay beneath. Every creak of the house settling, every rustle of wind through the corn, every distant animal call seemed to carry new meaning, new potential threat. By nightfall, they had reached a decision. The explosion had made clear the stakes and the lengths to which Kendricks would go to protect their operation. They needed definitive evidence that would directly link the company to the tunnels, the environmental contamination, and the unauthorized extraction activities. "We need internal company records," Kayla had explained. "Maintenance logs, extraction data, documentation showing Kendrick's active management of these operations. Something their corporate lawyers can't dismiss as legacy infrastructure they inherited without knowledge." Early the next morning, Henry returned with supplies: stronger flashlights, climbing equipment, and air quality monitors borrowed from a friend who worked in mine safety. Kayla arrived shortly after, accompanied by her colleague, Dr. Marcus Chen, a serious, compact man with expertise in industrial contamination and experience documenting corporate environmental violations. "We found a second access point yesterday," Jerome explained, spreading a rough map of his property across the kitchen table. "An old equipment shed near the North Woodlot. The trap door there connects to a different section of the tunnel system than the one that was destroyed. Based on what we've seen so far, the network is extensive," Kayla added, pointing to areas they had already explored. "Multiple levels, different construction periods, various operational areas. We've only scratched the surface." "Our target should be their control center," Marcus suggested. "Every operation of this scale has a central hub where they monitor systems, maintain records, and coordinate activities. Find that, and we'll have everything we need to prove current corporate knowledge and direction." "How do we locate it?" Henry asked. Marcus removed a device from his pack that resembled a sophisticated compass. "Electromagnetic field detector. The control center will have significant power requirements, electronic equipment, communication systems. This will help us find areas of concentrated electrical activity within the tunnel network." They spent the morning planning their approach: entry through the equipment shed access point, a targeted exploration of the southern tunnel branches where they had observed the most active operations, and a clear focus on documenting current corporate management of the system. "We go tonight," Jerome decided, "after dark. Less chance of being observed entering the tunnels, and nighttime might mean reduced personnel in the system." As they finalized their preparations, Jerome stood at the window, watching his fields in the morning light. The explosion site was a dark wound in the southern landscape, visible even from the house. His land, his responsibility. 3 generations of Hales had worked this soil, believing they understood its nature and rhythms. Now he knew differently. Someone had stolen from beneath his feet for decades. Tonight he would gather the evidence needed to expose that theft. Darkness fell heavy and complete, clouds obscuring the moon and stars, providing ideal cover for their mission. Jerome, Henry, Kayla, and Marcus gathered in the barn to make final preparations, each carrying equipment suited to their role in the operation. "Communications check," Kayla said, distributing small two-way radios with earpieces. "These are short-range, but should work within the tunnel system." Marcus demonstrated the air quality monitors they would carry. "These will alert us to dangerous gas concentrations, oxygen depletion, or volatile compounds. If the alarm sounds, we evacuate immediately, no exceptions." They moved through the darkness toward the equipment shed, their headlamps extinguished to avoid detection. The old structure loomed ahead, its weathered boards glistening with dew, appearing exactly as it had for decades. An unremarkable farm building, concealing a remarkable secret. Inside, they secured the door behind them and illuminated the space with their headlamps. The trap door lay where they had left it, concealed beneath tarps and old equipment parts. Henry and Jerome moved the covering materials aside, revealing the access point to the tunnel system below. "I'll go first," Marcus volunteered, already attaching a compact climbing system to the metal rungs. "I want to check air quality immediately." No one argued. Marcus disappeared into the opening, the beam of his headlamp fading as he descended the shaft. After a tense minute, his voice came through their earpieces. "Air quality acceptable. Oxygen levels normal. Some elevated VOCs, but well below danger thresholds. Clear to proceed." They descended one by one, each checking their equipment upon reaching the tunnel floor. The passage looked much as Jerome and Henry remembered from their previous exit, an older section of the network, with wooden supports and signs of earlier mining operations. This section dates to the earliest operations, Kayla observed, examining the construction techniques. Probably 1950s, based on the materials and methods. Which direction? Henry asked, his headlamp illuminating three possible passages branching from their position. Marcus consulted his electromagnetic field detector. Strongest power sources are in that direction, he said, pointing to the rightmost tunnel, suggesting active operations that way. They moved forward, the tunnel gradually transitioning from older construction to more modern infrastructure. Metal supports replacing wood, proper electrical conduits along the walls, and eventually actual flooring instead of packed earth. The air grew warmer, carrying that same chemical tang they had noticed during their previous exploration. "We're approaching active operations," Marcus whispered, his instruments showing increasing electromagnetic activity and higher concentrations of petroleum compounds in the air. They reached a junction where their passage intersected with a larger, more developed tunnel equipped with a rail system. Small electric carts were parked along one wall, clearly used for transporting personnel and equipment through the extensive network. "This is a main thoroughfare," Kayla observed, photographing the vehicles and rail system. "Look at the wear patterns on the rails. This gets heavy, regular use." They followed the main tunnel, moving with increased caution now that they were in an area of obvious active operations. The sound of machinery grew more distinct, pumps, ventilation systems, and the occasional metallic clang that suggested human activity somewhere deeper in the network. After approximately half a mile, they reached a security door, a heavy metal barrier with a keypad access system and a small camera mounted above it. The door wasn't completely closed, however. It had been left ajar, perhaps by personnel expecting to return soon. "Careful," Marcus warned, examining the door without touching it. "There may be alarm systems that trigger if the door moves beyond a certain point." They squeezed through the opening one by one, minimizing any disturbance to the door's position. Beyond lay a section of the tunnel system unlike anything they had seen before, a proper underground facility with concrete walls, tile flooring, and recessed lighting fixtures in the ceiling. Signs mounted at intervals displayed safety warnings and directional information, many bearing the Kendrick's Energy logo and corporate styling. "This is exactly what we need," Kayla whispered, photographing every sign and corporate identifier. "Clear, current branding on active infrastructure." They continued deeper, following signs pointing toward central monitoring and operations control. The facility became increasingly sophisticated, with proper office-like spaces branching off the main corridor, small rooms containing desks, computer equipment, and filing cabinets. In one room, they found exactly what they were seeking: a wall of filing cabinets labeled with different sections of the tunnel system, each containing detailed maintenance logs, extraction data, and inspection reports. The most recent entries were dated just 2 days earlier. "This is gold," Kayla whispered, carefully photographing logbooks and reports without disturbing their organization. Current operational documentation with Kendrick's letterhead, executive signatures, and detailed extraction data. This proves active management and corporate knowledge. Marcus was examining a computer terminal that had been left on, its screen displaying a monitoring system for different sections of the network. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a map of the entire tunnel system. "It's bigger than we thought, at least 50 miles of tunnels extending under multiple properties throughout the county." Jerome stared at the map in disbelief. The network spread like a spider's web beneath the countryside, connecting dozens of extraction points, monitoring stations, and what appeared to be storage facilities. His farm was just one node in a vast underground infrastructure that had been operating undetected for generations. "They've been doing this across the entire county," he said, the scale of the violation dawning on him. "Not just my land, everyone's." "And look at these environmental readings," Marcus added, scrolling through data on the monitor. "They're recording groundwater contamination levels at various points in the system. They know they're polluting the aquifer. They're tracking it themselves." Henry, who had been keeping watch near the door, suddenly raised a hand for silence. "Someone's coming," he whispered urgently. "I hear voices." They froze, listening intently. Sure enough, the sound of conversation was growing louder, approaching their position from further down the corridor. Back the way we came, Kayla mouthed, already moving toward the door. But before they could exit, the voices divided, some continuing down the main corridor, others turning toward the office where they were hiding. They were about to be discovered. Other exit, Marcus hissed, pointing to a second door at the back of the office that they hadn't noticed before. They slipped through it just as footsteps reached the office entrance, finding themselves in a narrow service corridor that ran parallel to the main passage. Through the thin wall, they could hear people entering the office they had just vacated, the voices clearer now. Scheduled inspection of Section 7 after that incident with the farm property yesterday. Phillips wants everything documented before the regulatory inquiry. Waste of time. We've handled these situations before. A few well-placed calls, some documentation about unauthorized drilling tests by the landowner. Case closed. This one's different. They actually got inside the tunnels, documented the operation. We don't know how much they saw or what evidence they collected. Jerome and the others exchanged glances. Kendricks was already preparing their defense, already developing a narrative to discredit whatever evidence Jerome might present. The company clearly had significant experience managing incidents and relationships with regulatory authorities. They continued along the service corridor, moving silently away from the voices behind them. The passage was clearly meant for maintenance access, containing pipes, electrical conduits, and occasional tool storage alcoves. It provided an unexpected opportunity to move deeper into the facility while avoiding the more populated main corridors. After several hundred yards, they reached an intersection where the service passage connected to what appeared to be a larger mechanical room. The space was filled with pumping equipment, pressure regulators, and control panels monitoring the flow of whatever was being extracted and transported through the tunnel system. "This is a primary collection hub," Marcus whispered, examining the infrastructure with obvious expertise. "They're aggregating petroleum products from multiple extraction points, regulating pressure and flow, then routing it somewhere else in the system." Kayla was documenting everything, her camera capturing the equipment configurations, pressure readings, and most importantly, the maintenance logs attached to each major component. The logs all bore recent dates and Kendrick's Energy corporate headers. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a schematic mounted on one wall. It showed the entire collection system, with clear labels indicating which extraction points fed into this hub. Jerome's property was prominently marked, along with a dozen other locations throughout the county. "They've divided the entire underground reservoir into extraction zones," Marcus explained, studying the schematic. "Each zone is tapped with multiple collection points, all feeding into central hubs like this one, which then route the petroleum to what appears to be a processing facility further south." Jerome was photographing a different document, a geological survey map showing the underground oil deposit that Kendricks had been secretly extracting for decades. The map included estimated reserves, extraction rates, and projected depletion timelines. According to the data, the operation had removed millions of barrels of oil worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "This is what it's all about," he said, his voice tight with anger. "All this secrecy, all this infrastructure to steal oil without paying royalties or obtaining proper permits, without even telling the people whose land they're drilling under." A sudden increase in activity from the main corridor interrupted their documentation. More voices, more footsteps, a general sense of movement and purpose that hadn't been present before. "Something's happening," Henry whispered, moving closer to the mechanical room's entrance to listen. "They're mobilizing people. I hear orders being given." Through the partially open door, they could make out fragments of conversation. "Full security sweep of all main tunnels and access points. Monitoring detected unauthorized entry near Section 9. Seal all non-essential areas until further notice." "They know someone's in the tunnels," Kayla whispered, alarm evident in her voice. "We need to leave, now." They had what they came for. The guy came for extensive documentation of Kendrick's current operations, corporate knowledge of environmental impacts, and clear evidence of the scale and value of the resources being extracted without permission. It was time to retreat while they still could. The increase in activity complicated their exit strategy. The main corridors were now filled with personnel responding to the security alert, making their original route too dangerous. Instead, they continued through the service passages, following the maintenance tunnels that ran parallel to the main system. These service tunnels might lead to emergency exits, Marcus suggested. Safety regulations would require multiple evacuation routes from an underground facility of this size. They moved as quickly as safety allowed, aware that every minute increased the risk of discovery. The service passages were less well-maintained than the main corridors, with lower ceilings, exposed pipes, and occasional leaks that created puddles on the concrete floor. But they were mercifully empty of personnel, allowing the group to make steady progress away from the central facility. After navigating a complex series of turns and junctions, they reached what appeared to be an emergency exit, a vertical shaft with metal rungs leading upward, similar to the access point they had used to enter the system. "This could be our way out," Henry said, examining the shaft. "Question is, where does it lead?" Marcus consulted his electromagnetic sensor. "We've been heading northeast. If my calculations are correct, this should emerge somewhere near the county road that runs along the eastern edge of Jerome's property." Marcus pulled out a small device that looked like a periscope with a digital display. "Fiber optic camera," he explained, extending the flexible tube upward into the shaft. "Let's see what's waiting for us up there." The camera's view appeared on the display, showing the shaft extending approximately 30 feet upward to what appeared to be a simple metal hatch. There was no obvious security equipment or monitoring devices visible. "Looks clear," Marcus reported. "Standard emergency exit design. The hatch probably opens into some kind of surface structure designed to look innocuous. A utility shed, equipment housing, something that wouldn't attract attention." "I'll go first," Henry volunteered. "If there's trouble up there, I'm best equipped to handle it." No one argued. Henry began the climb, moving carefully but efficiently up the metal rungs. The others watched anxiously as he ascended, disappearing into the darkness above. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a couple of minutes, Henry's voice came through their earpieces. "Hatch is unlocked. Opening now." Another tense moment passed. "Clear. We're in some kind of maintenance shed near the county road. No personnel visible." One by one, they climbed the shaft, emerging into a small concrete structure filled with what appeared to be legitimate utility equipment, a clever disguise for the emergency exit. A single door led outside, where they found themselves beside a gravel access road that connected to the main county highway. Just as Marcus had calculated, they were near the eastern boundary of Jerome's property, though about a mile from the farmhouse itself. "We'll have to hike back," Jerome said, orienting himself despite the darkness. "Through the fields, staying off the main roads." They set off across the darkened landscape, moving like shadows through Jerome's cornfields, each carrying evidence that would change the course of history for the farm and potentially the entire county. The documentation they had gathered revealed not just the extent of Kendrick's current operations, but the decades of deception, environmental damage, and theft of resources that had occurred beneath the feet of unsuspecting landowners. As they approached the farmhouse, headlights appeared on the distant farm road, vehicles approaching the property. "Company," Henry said quietly, moving to an observation position behind a tree line. They watched as 3 vehicles pulled into the farm's entrance road, 2 large SUVs and what appeared to be a utility truck. The vehicles stopped short of the house, parking near the barn instead. Men emerged, their forms indistinct through the darkness, but their movements purposeful. "Security team," Marcus assessed, watching their deployment pattern. "Professional. They're establishing a perimeter." "Kendricks?" Jerome asked. "Most likely," Kayla confirmed. "They must have tracked our exit from the tunnel system, or they're checking properties after detecting the security breach." "We need to leave," Kayla said firmly. "All of us, with all the evidence. We can't risk confrontation or having any of this material seized." Jerome felt a surge of resistance at the idea of abandoning his farm, but he recognized the logic of Kayla's position. The evidence they had gathered was too important to risk. It represented not just his own justice, but potentially justice for every landowner affected by Kendrick's operations. "My truck is behind the house," he said, making his decision. "If we leave through the back fields, we can circle around to the county road without being spotted." They moved with quiet efficiency, gathering the evidence containers, computer equipment, and sample cases. Each person took responsibility for a portion of the material, ensuring nothing would be left behind if they became separated. "Where do we go?" Jerome asked as they prepared to leave through the back door. "My research station," Kayla suggested. "We have secure storage facilities, proper equipment for analyzing the samples, and it's an official government facility. They can't enter without warrants." They slipped out into the night, moving in a crouch across the back garden and into the cornfield beyond. The tall stalks provided cover despite being flattened in places. They moved in single file, Jerome leading the way through his familiar fields, navigating by instinct and lifelong knowledge of the land. Behind them, flashlight beams cut through the darkness around the barn and equipment sheds. The security team was conducting a thorough search, but had not yet approached the house or discovered their departure. They reached Jerome's truck where he had parked it earlier behind a stand of trees at the field's edge. The vehicle was mud-splattered but operational, its four-wheel drive essential for navigating the farm roads. "Everyone in," Jerome whispered, opening the doors. "Keep low." They loaded their precious cargo into the back seat and truck bed, covering it with tarps for protection. Then they climbed in, Jerome and Henry in the front, Kayla and Marcus in the back, surrounded by the evidence cases. Jerome started the engine, wincing at its noise. He put the truck in gear and began a careful path along the field's edge. Headlights off, navigating by the occasional flash of lightning and his intimate knowledge of the terrain. They had nearly reached the boundary of his property when headlights appeared on the main farm road behind them. The security team had discovered their absence and was now in pursuit. "They've spotted us," Henry said, watching the approaching lights through the rear window. "Hold on," Jerome warned, pressing the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning in the mud before finding purchase. They bounced across the uneven ground, Jerome steering toward a gap in the fence line that would allow them to access the neighboring property and eventually the county road beyond. The pursuing vehicles were faster on the main farm road, but limited in where they could drive. Jerome's knowledge of the land gave them an advantage. He knew every drainage ditch, every firm section of ground, every passage between fields that could accommodate a vehicle. They crashed through the fence gap, the truck fishtailing slightly before Jerome corrected its course. Ahead lay a section of pasture, then another fence line, and beyond that, the county road that would take them to the relative safety of the research station. The pursuing vehicles had divided, some continuing along the main road in an attempt to cut them off, others attempting to follow their off-road route, but struggling with the unfamiliar terrain. "They're trying to flank us," Henry observed, tracking the headlights. "Reach the county road before we do." Jerome nodded grimly, pushing the truck faster despite the dangerous conditions. The vehicle bounced and slid, but he maintained control, guiding it unerringly toward their escape route. They reached the final fence line, where Jerome had installed a gate years earlier to allow farm equipment to move between fields. The gate was closed but not locked. A simple chain loop secured it in place. Jerome braked briefly while Henry jumped out, released the chain, and swung the gate open. The truck lurched through, and Henry closed the gate behind them, delaying any pursuers by precious seconds. The county road appeared ahead, a ribbon of asphalt shining wetly in the occasional lightning flash. They turned onto it, Jerome finally activating the headlights now that stealth was less important than speed and safety. The truck accelerated, tires finding better traction on the paved surface. In the rearview mirror, headlights appeared at the field entrance they had just left. The security team had navigated the pasture more quickly than expected. The vehicles pulled onto the county road behind them, giving chase. "How far to the research station?" Jerome asked, focusing on the road ahead. "About 15 miles, Kayla replied. "Take the next right, then stay on Road 17 until we reach the river bridge." Jerome followed her directions, the truck maintaining a steady speed despite the hazardous conditions. Behind them, the pursuing vehicles were gaining ground, their more powerful engines an advantage on the open road. He took the next turn sharply, leaving the main route to follow a smaller access road that ran parallel to the river. This road was narrower, darker, with overhanging trees and multiple unmarked intersections, a maze of rural byways that Jerome knew intimately from decades of farming in the area. "Local knowledge," Henry said with approval, understanding Jerome's strategy. "They won't know which turns to take." Jerome navigated the back roads with confidence despite the darkness, taking seemingly random turns that were actually part of a deliberate route toward the research station. Behind them, the pursuing vehicles hesitated at intersections, sometimes choosing wrong paths and having to double back, gradually losing ground in the confusing network of country lanes. By the time they reached the final approach to the research station, the pursuers were no longer visible in their mirrors, at least temporarily lost in the rural labyrinth Jerome had led them through. The research station appeared ahead, its perimeter marked by security fencing and bright lights that cut through the darkness. Kayla used an electronic key card to open the main gate, and Jerome drove directly to the loading dock at the rear of the main building. "Get everything inside," Kayla directed, already opening her door. "Quickly. They'll figure out where we've gone eventually." They unloaded the evidence cases with urgent efficiency, carrying them into the building where Kayla used her credentials to access a secure storage area specifically designed for maintaining chain of custody for environmental samples and evidence. "This is a certified evidence storage facility," she explained as they placed the materials inside. "Temperature controlled, access limited and logged, video monitoring 24/7. Everything we've collected is now officially part of a government environmental investigation." Jerome felt a profound sense of relief as the secure storage door closed and locked. The evidence was safe. The truth they had risked so much to uncover was now protected by official government security protocols and chain of custody procedures. "What now?" he asked, water still dripping from his rain-soaked clothes onto the facility's clean tile floor. "Now we make this official," Kayla said, moving to a computer terminal and beginning to log the evidence into the system. "I'm registering everything under an emergency environmental investigation protocol, which flags it for immediate attention from state and federal authorities." Marcus was already on his phone, speaking quietly but intensely to someone he had identified only as a contact at Justice. Henry stood by the windows, watching for any sign of the security team that had pursued them from the farm. Jerome found himself momentarily at loose ends, the adrenaline of their escape giving way to a bone-deep weariness. He hadn't abandoned his farm. He had left it strategically to protect the evidence that would ultimately restore justice not just for himself but for every landowner affected by Kendrick's operations. Kayla approached, her professional demeanor softened by evident concern. "The evidence is secure," she assured him, "and I've initiated the official investigation protocols. By morning, this will be on the desks of senior officials at multiple agencies." "And my farm?" Jerome asked. "We'll have to wait before returning," she advised honestly, "at least until official investigators are involved. Kendrick's security team has no legal right to occupy your property, but confronting them directly would be dangerous without law enforcement support." Jerome nodded, accepting the necessity of patience despite his desire to reclaim his land immediately. The wheels of justice were now in motion, but they would turn at their own pace, not his. "You should all get some rest," Kayla suggested, gesturing toward a break room down the hall. "There are shower facilities, spare clothes in the emergency lockers, and cots for overnight work shifts. Tomorrow will be busy, and we'll need to be ready." As Jerome headed toward the promised shower, he glanced back at the secure storage room where the evidence was now safely contained. In that room lay the truth about what had been happening beneath his land for 60 years. The corporate theft, the environmental damage, the systematic exploitation of land owners throughout the county. Tomorrow, that truth would begin to spread, first through official channels, then potentially through media coverage and public awareness. Kendrick's energy was about to discover that some secrets couldn't stay buried forever, no matter how deep the tunnels that contained them.